Hi, my name is Tong. And my name is Eric. I'm Tong's friend. What did you think of the new Fast and Furious movie that came out? I don't watch any of that crap. Modern Hollywood movies are all garbage. I prefer the independent indie films. Modern Hollywood movies are all special effects and no story. Hollywood movies started going downhill after the 2000s. There's only been a few good Hollywood films released since then, like Almost Famous, Dark Knight, Interstellar and Joker, but not much else. They lost the storytelling and charm that they had back in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Movies like Godfather, Andromeda Strain, 2001, A Space Odyssey, The Hustler, The Apartment, Barry Lyndon, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Color of Money, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Hitchcock films like Psycho or Rebecca or The Birds or Rope. These were classics. These movies were experimental masterpieces of script writing and cinematography. Even into the 1980s you had films that were blockbusters and had mainstream appeal but balanced it with great story writing and action like Back to the Future, the original Star Wars trilogy, the original Indiana Jones trilogy, RoboCop, Predator, Rambo, Karate Kid, Alien, and Aliens, and a lot of coming-of-age movies in the 1980s were classic, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Goonies, Big, Stand By Me, Breakfast Club, The Last Starfighter, Some Kind of Wonderful. These were all great. Also some of those 1980s war films like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket too. And especially horror films. Modern Hollywood cannot produce a good horror film. Back in the 1970s and 1980s we had classics like Fight Night, Rosemary's Baby, Texas Chainsaw, The Shining and my all-time favorite horror film, Dawn of the Dead, that balanced horror, a sense of fear, and great characters and storytelling. Nowadays all we get is cheap thrills and slashers. It was Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street that started all that slasher crap. But it got even worse in the 1990s. That decade had so many cheap slasher flicks like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer and Blair Witch Project. All cheap, overrated thrills. At least the 1990s had good dramas though like Shawshank Redemption, Forrest Gump, American Beauty, and Schindler's List. Nowadays we don't even get that anymore. It's a shame about how downhill horror went though. Train to Busan for example, the first half was fun but the second half was dumb and had the typical Korean melodramatic ending with the girl singing in the tunnel as they walk out. There's no modern horror film that compares to the ones I named. Or even to The Haunting, The Innocents, Fearless Vampire Killers, Howling, Salem's Lot. The Exorcist was a finely crafted film but might seem a bit dated now for horror fans. Lost Boys is a wicked fun film with loads of energy, cool 80s setting and characters, offbeat and edgy, but lacking as a horror film. And then there's the Hong Kong campy horror films like Haunted Cop Shop 1 and 2, Chinese Ghost Story, Close Encounters of the Spooky Kind, Mr. Possessed, Mr. Vampire, all really fun movies. I'd rather watch any of the anime streaming on Netflix these days, there's a lot of good ones. High Score Girl for example gets so in-depth about the arcade scene back in the 1990s. The characters even exploit some of the bugs in the game. Like the main character was trying to use Guile in Street Fighter 2 and turtle his way to win and using a cheap jab link to throw to win. And the anime even explains all this stuff and saying why it's cheap and frowned upon. Then the next day the main character stops by a corner store that had 2 arcade machines but he only had enough quarters for 1 game. And they only had Final Fight and Ghosts and Goblins. And he's looking at the 2 thinking to himself which to play. And he's thinking he'll get more his money's worth with Final Fight cause the game will probably last longer and that Ghosts and Goblins he'll die a super quick death, but the store owner keeps urging him to play Ghosts and Goblins. And he talks about the tricks to beat Final Fight all on 1 credit. And in Street Fighter 2, he's surprised the girl learning the game was able to pull off a sudden back jump kick counter. And how tick throws is considered cheap in the arcades. It was considered super cheap to do that and you'll be looking for a fight if you did it. The main character was using Guile's air throw which is a secret move in the original Street Fighter 2. It's actually a bug in the game and wasn't meant to be used by players. You see all the details they talk about. Way more depth in Japanese animes than you'll ever find in a typical American Saturday morning cartoon. Or Hajime no Ippo talking about boxing. Or Midnight Diner talking about food and life. Or Slam Dunk talking about basketball. Or Maison-ikkoku, a very charming 1980s anime where you feel all the heartaches and joys in a heartwarming coming-of-age story. Or some of the classic 1970s Lupin the Third animes where they get into very risque scenes but adding touches of humor onto it. And that's just the anime shows. There's also anime movies like the 1980s classic Night on the Galactic Railroad or Jirinko. Or some of the Studio Ghibli stuff like Only Yesterday and Whispers of the Heart. Or Satoshi Kon with his classic anime movies Tokyo Godfathers and Millennium Actress. He makes references to Dostoevsky, Neyashiga and Kuwabata Yazunari literature in his anime. All of these animes have so much depth and heart and go into so much detail, much more so than any Western animation or non-animation actually. And don't even get me started on that hack Quentin Tarantino. Most overrated director ever. All he does is steal and rip off other films and repackage it as his own and everyone thinks he's some kind of genius. For example, Reservoir Dogs he stole parts of that movie frame for frame from the Hong Kong movie City on Fire. And Pulp Fiction is just his incoherent ripoff of Arthur's films by Jean-Luc Godard, Stanley Kubrick and Wong Kar-wai. Kill Bill is stolen from Lady Snowblood and has lots of elements of Akira Kurosawa and Shaw Brothers in it, he just takes bits and pieces of other films, smashes them together without any of the depth, puts in some catchy music and calls it his own. Did you know he distributed Asian films under his label Rolling Thunder Pictures, and for John Yumu's Hero or Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express he just puts the original director's name in small print and in big font and letters puts his own name Quentin Tarantino Presents in big letters to fool the public into thinking they are his own films. What a hack. But as blatant as Tarantino is, Koreans are even more blatant when they steal films. Squid Games is just a ripoff of Battle Royale and Hunger Games. That Korean drama Itaewon Class is a ripoff of a classic Hong Kong drama called Looking Back in Anger. Besides Secret Sunshine and Burning, I haven't been impressed with any Korean film I've watched. All their films are just pretentious shallow commentaries on social structures. For example, Parasite is just an expected twist and commentary on social structure, and everyone dies in the end. Most Korean thrillers end up like this, it's unoriginal and pretentious. And I'm not even mentioning all the great foreign films that I've watched too. Back in the 1950s, all the classic Akira Kurosawa stuff. High and Low, Akira, Rashomon, Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, or the Yasujiro Ozu classic Tokyo Story. Those are all way better than any of the stuff Hollywood produces today. I'd much rather watch any of the independent filmmakers like Hirokazu Korita, Ken Loach, Mia Hansen-Løve, Jean-Marc Vallée, Aisling Walsh, Yuri Bykov, Sergei Dvortsevoy, Krzysztof Kieslowski, David Linklater, Sidney Lumet, Jacques Demy, Mike Onarius. These are all underrated directors who produce much more detailed and in-depth movies than Tarantino or any modern Korean film could dream of. I mean, just off the top of my head, I can name Korita Still Walking, After the Storm, I Wish, Shoplifters, Nobody Knows, or two samurai films I've watched called Twilight Samurai or The Hidden Blade, this French Quebec film called Crazy by Jean-Marc Vallée, Madi, Born to be Blue, One Week, these French films Amour and Mia Hansen-Løve's Things to Come, any of the 60s stuff by Ken Loach, Truffaut, Masaki Kobayashi, Kubrick, Roman Polanski, Ingmar Bergman, Jan Troll, David Lean, Kurosawa. Or the 1980s Hong Kong action films by John Woo, starring Andy Lau, Leslie Cheung, Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, Chow Yun-fat. These were all way better than Hollywood's action films back then. Stuff like A Better Tomorrow, God of Gamblers, The Killers, Hard Boiled, Days of Being Wild, these were way better than all that Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone holding a gun. That's why when people said Terminator 2 was great, I laughed at them. That's just Arnold holding a gun. Or Die Hard, which is barely any action. I watched Chow Yun-fat shoot up a bunch of dudes while lying backwards on a motorcycle jumping off of a van. And they all did their own stunts back then too, by the way. That's why Hollywood eventually ended up hiring those Hong Kong action choreographers like Yuen Woo-ping, and actors like Chow Yun-fat and Jackie Chan came over. Because Hollywood action needed them, so films like The Matrix had noticeably better action since they took a lot of those Hong Kong guys over. Everything you see now in the Marvel or John Wick action films came from Hong Kong back then. But yeah, way better than anything in Fast and the Furious. Not to mention the Hong Kong dramas back then too. Especially the 1980s TVB dramas based on the Jin Yong novels and the Condor trilogy, I highly recommend watching them. That's Tony Leung and Andy Lau in their primes. Don't watch the newer mainland Jin Yong dramas, they suck. Watch the old 1980s ones. That's the good stuff. Or Hong Kong comedies like all the Sammo Hung stuff, I especially recommend A Moment of Romance, Painted Faces, Winners and Sinners, Paper Marriage, and My Lucky Stars. Those are laugh out loud classic with tons of charm, but you need to really understand Cantonese for them to really make sense. Way better than any modern Hollywood comedies. For example, in Paper Marriage, Sammo plays this poor uneducated Chinese immigrant here in North America, who has a gambling problem and always broke, no job, and to make money he agrees to get into a fake marriage to help a Hong Kong chick get her visa and citizenship, and a lot of funny crap happens. Films like this show the range of Sammo and HK films back then. It's got everything. Drama, comedy, romance, action, and a lot of heart. They are able to film and capture the feeling of what it feels like for a person going to foreign country alone, how tough and lonely it is. When Hollywood makes an action movie, it's only action and that's it. No characters, no story, but when you watch a Sammo movie like Paper Marriage, you will ask yourself, is it a drama? Is it romance? Is it action? Is it comedy? It's got all four. And Maggie Cheung, who you should know from Wong Kar-wai films like In the Mood for Love, is much younger in this film, so I highly recommend this one as well as all other Sammo films and 80s HK films in general. Curry and Pepper, for example, which has Stephen Chow and Jackie Cheung in it, is a way better and funnier version of Lethal Weapon. Or some of Moon Lee's action movies, which she did all of her own stunts in, of course, just like everyone else in HK at the time. These days you have an actor like Tom Cruise do his own stunts and people go apeshit over it. That was the norm in HK back then, and people worked on 2 or 3 films at a time, non-stop 7 days a week, and a lot of those actors had to be singers as well just to supplement their income. Impressive stuff. I see. I can clearly tell you are not into the mainstream stuff as much. Well, it depends. I like some mainstream stuff if it's good. Like Godfather is mainstream and I like it. But other mainstream stuff I find overrated. For example, Citizen Kane. Good for its time, but it's hardly the best movie ever like people think. It's definitely aged quite a bit. And actors like Humphrey Bogart and Cary Grant get extremely overrated because of the movies they are in. They basically just play the same characters every movie and people say they are the greatest. They have no range. Bogart is always this hard-boiled loner type on the outside with a heart on the inside. He shows some of his range in the movie Treasure of Sierra Madre, which is probably my favorite, but he's no Max von Sydow. Now that's a great actor. If you watch any of his acting in those Ingmar Bergman movies like The Seventh Seal, that's what I mean. Or Takashi Shimura. Or Roddy McDowall. But yeah, actors like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Harrison Ford get way overrated because they are iconic rather than they are great actors. If you put any of today's modern actors in North by Northwest, they'd do way better than Cary Grant. Put any of today's actors in Star Wars and Indiana Jones, of course they can act just as well as Ford could. Or John Wayne, any of his cowboy movies I'm sure anyone today can do. Those old actors are just famous because they are iconic, not because they had a lot of range. All of today's actors are method and better overall than classic actors, but the problem is they are in horribly written movies that rarely get to show off their capabilities. Daniel Day-Lewis, Denzel Washington, Joaquin Phoenix, William Dafoe, Christian Bale, all of these guys can act circles around Ford or Arnold or Bogart or Grant. It's just those guys are more iconic for their specific roles in those older movies. It's just like how J.K. Rowling got super famous for writing Harry Potter, but she's not the writer that Ursula L. Le Guin is. She just has more mainstream appeal, that's all. Or guys like Stephen King can write all these mainstream horror novels, but none of his stories have much depth or curiosity to them. Now I love J.R.R. Tolkien and H.G. Wells as fantasy and science fiction writers and their ability to build fantastical worlds, but they lack any depth with characters. Jin Yong is better than both. He's like J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy world building combined with the character depth of Charles Dickens and the philosophy of Ursula L. Le Guin and the tragedy of Shakespeare. Or like Robert Louis Stevenson, except more broader in scope, deeper cultural roots, more philosophical, more creative. I also think Jin Yong influenced some of Bruce Lee's philosophies because before Bruce died, he was working on some wuxia artwork and his theories about being formless is very similar to Jin Yong's state of divinity. In Return of the Condor Heroes, the main character scaled a cliff and stumbled upon an ancient tomb of a legend Gao Xiao which no one knew about cause the legend predated them by hundreds of years. Not even the four greats talked about this legend, and in this tomb he discovered a bunch of different swords, each one represented a stage in the development of this legend's martial arts. Until his ultimate stage all you saw was just some withered grass, but by his ultimate stage he already achieved formlessness and the no sword beats sword level. Prior to this last stage, his weapon was just the wooden sword, and before the wooden sword was the heavy sword made of exotic material, and before that was a soft metal sword. You can theorize every step of the way how his martial arts evolved, and I think Bruce Lee was affected by a lot of this because the character in the novel, The Ancient Tomb, the main character chose to use his heavy sword, which was a sword so heavy most people can't wield it unless you cultivated your internal chi strength to a legendary level, and the main character figured out how to cultivate his chi based on this legend style, but he couldn't figure out the moves, but he learned that his legend's training spot here had a waterfall with falling boulders, which is where he learned after not to worry about form and sets but be formless and setless cause you never know when and where the boulders fall from, and to strike first at times before the opponent can even attack cause the heavy sword was near unblockable. However, this legend also had an earlier martial art called Dugu Nine Swords, which I guess you can consider like Phil Jackson's triangle offense. Not based on sets but based on a system of counters. You learn all the basic fundamental counters, and no matter what you face, as long as you read right, you can counter anything, which is also like the formless no set thing and not about fixed stances, which Bruce hated. The main character learned stuff from so many different sides. He eventually tried to cultivate it all into his own. He learned Quanzhen Taoist martial arts, Ancient Tomb martial arts, West Poison Camel Mountain and East Heretic martial arts, and mixed it all before running into that ancient tomb. And all this being like an Oliver Twist type character growing up as an orphan, being misunderstood and hated on by everyone and trying to figure out his past, why people treated him the way they did. A coming-of-age story about transcending your environment and love and patriotism and everything. Which is why Jin Yong is so damn special. You have the super creative fantasy aspects along with philosophy, theory, culture, deep character studies. And history too. Many Western people are probably unaware of aspects of Chinese history that Jin Yong really delved deep into. Westerners always talk about how great the Roman Empire is and how vast it was, but the fact and truth of the matter is that the Han Chinese Empire around that time was bigger and more powerful. Romans didn't have to fight or defeat many powerful opponents like the Han Empire did. Romans just had to fight various small factions like the Visigoths and the Huns. By the way, the Huns were the weaker version of the nomadic tribes that the Han Empire had to fight off all the time. The Xiongnu were way more powerful and the Han Empire had to fend them off for centuries. The Romans never had to fight anyone with that kind of strength. The Huns were the weaker remnants of the Xiongnu and they devastated the Romans. Then of course later China had to fend off more nomadic powers like the Khitans, Jurchens, Mongolians, and eventually the Manchurians. The Mongols were the most powerful from a combat standpoint, which is why they were able to take over nearly all of Asia and very nearly Japan too, if it wasn't for some very lucky typhoons that took out Kublai Khan's ships that were about to invade them. Of course the Japanese were also quite strong on land too due to centuries of civil war. When they invaded Korea in the late 1500s, other than the navy battles which the Koreans won, the Japanese were quite easily able to defeat the Koreans on land, which is why Koreans had to ask Ming China for help to defeat them back then. But yeah, with Mongolians the issue is they know how to conquer well on land but they don't know how to administrate well. Lots of infighting happened after Kublai Khan died, which by the way was the guy who actually took over China. Lots of Westerners think that was Genghis Khan, but he never did it before he died. It was actually his grandson Kublai who did it. So the Mongolian Yuan dynasty dissolved quite shortly after, since Mongolians didn't know how to maintain their power. That's where the Manchurians learned from, and when the Manchurians took over China during the Qing dynasty, they were able to secure their power for much longer and learn from the Mongolians' mistakes. They intermarried, mingled with and assimilated with Han Chinese in order to secure their grip on China. And some Manchurian emperors, as you know as a fellow Manchu yourself, like Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, were some of the best emperors of Chinese history due to how well they managed and administrated the country. Which is somewhat of a revelation for a former nomadic tribe like the Manchurians. The reason why nomadic tribes historically have been so great at conquering on land is because they lived in barren areas with few resources and cold climates. This forced them to take over other areas just to survive. And of course, since they are nomadic, they are very good at riding horses, using bows and arrows, and general combat techniques. They had to fight just to be able to survive. That's why you see historically, the best conquerors all came from the northern hemisphere with colder climates. And nations in the more warmer areas with fertile resources tend to get complacent because they lose any drive to conquer other areas, which is what happened eventually to China during the Song dynasty, which allowed the Mongols to beat them and take them over, and again during the Ming dynasty, which allowed the Manchus to take over. Of course, China later declined in prestige and power after they got complacent and arrogant. They fought a war with Britain over tea, and lost to Western powers and Japanese during the 1800s. Japan of course industrialized the earliest, since they were forced to open up to Western trade by Americans in the 1850s. Then during the Meiji era, due to industrialization and technological advances, they were able to quite easily defeat China, take over Taiwan and Manchuria and Korea during this time due to their technological superiority. See, this is the type of history that Jin Yong would delve into, except he focuses more on the Mongolian period, and those 1980s TVB Jin Yong dramas had all this detail, the relationships between the Mongolian generals, Kublai Khan, and the brother-like bond between him and his most trusted general, very much like the brother-like bond between Leslie Chung and Chow Yun-fat's character in John Woo's A Better Tomorrow. All of that, it wasn't just about combat and action, which the modern mainland Chinese dramas focus on, but rather the emotional connections between the characters back then, which made the Hong Kong 1980s TVB dramas so special. Hong Kong had so much talent from the 70s and 80s, which was their absolute zenith. Because they didn't suffer from communism, they were able to maintain a lot of the traditional Chinese cultures that was lost in China, and also maintained a lot of traditional martial arts too. The dragon and lion dances, Chinese opera, Wing Chun, all took refuge in Hong Kong, and on top of maintaining this traditional Chinese culture, they also learned from the West. Modern day art, modern filmmaking, acting, classic rock music, and then being the only portal into China at the time, lots of money flowing in from investments mixed with all this led to an explosion of culture and talent. Sammo Hung, Jackie Chan, Yuan Biao, all these guys came from the same Chinese opera school, and art more or less lost in China cause of communism. Same with all the stuntmen in those eras. Bruce Lee and Wing Chun developed from that environment, and so did Jin Yong novels, which could only be written in Hong Kong at the time because of freedom of speech. Chow Yun-fat, Andy Lau, Leslie Chung, Tony Leung, is a result of the modern westernization of Hong Kong. They are all method actors who came from TVB, which during the late 1970s was a very modern, forward-thinking TV station that made all the classic and best TV dramas alongside ATV, their rival, so the TVB training classes were infamous back then for being super strict and tough. Cause they mixed in modern Western method acting alongside script writing and stunts and traditional martial arts training. All these actors came out from the TVB training classes, all started their careers with TV dramas first, so they all have such strong foundations. TVB back in the 70s and 80s was so cool, they would make experimental stuff like Don't Look Now is spooky, horror, family comedy drama about a family moving into a super old rundown apartment where an entire family died before, burned to death at night, and they would possess certain members of the family, and they'd have to act completely different depending on who was being possessed by who. They also took some influence from classic American horror shows like Dark Shadows. Every Hong Kong film back then had creativity and originality like Ghostbusters and wasn't politically correct. It's unfortunate that Jin Yong is not so well known in the West, because imagine if there was a Western writer like that. H.G. Wells gets a few film adaptations, War of the Worlds, and Time Machine, which by the way, watch the 1961, not the shitty 2002 one, and Tolkien of course has those early 2000s Lord of the Rings movies which were pretty decent, but Jin Yong doesn't get any Western film adaptations. A travesty, in my opinion. That's not to mention the fact that Japan and Hong Kong had much more interesting kids shows in general compared to American TV shows back then. The 1970s Japanese Spider-Man show as well as the 1960s Ultraman stuff was way better than what we got in America at the time. They fought all these cool exotic monsters. There was no live action shows like this in America, which were way behind. American shows were more low budget, like A-Team, which was just a bunch of dudes and no special effects. Knight Rider was just a car and the voice was some other guy on a microphone. In the 60s, Japan had live TV shows like Ultraman fighting monsters in full-scale city replicas with special effects and everything. Never saw anything of this scale on live-action TV in the West until recently. Even Hong Kong was making epic wuxia TV dramas from Jin Yong novels in the 80s with martial arts special effects, flying around on wires, and large epic battles which were period pieces based on ancient times. We didn't see that in the West until the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies and when Crouching Tiger Hidden Dragon got big in the West, which were both early 2000s. The only Western exception was V: The Final Victory, but that wasn't even a regular TV show, it was a TV miniseries, so they got a bit more funding. The stuff Japan was doing with Godzilla and Ultraman? Or Japan's 1971 Come On Rider show? Way better and more ambitious than anything America had back then. When America finally started doing that stuff, it was the 1990s with the Power Rangers. Japan did it in the 60s. Hong Kong was doing huge historical fantasy wuxia dramas about war, history, love, martial arts with fantasy and effects in the early 80s, and it took until 2000s for America to catch up. With America they didn't dare attempt anything like this until CGI technology evolved. Hong Kong was doing Jin Yong stuff about the Jurchens invading, Genghis Khan and the Mongols invading China, huge epic battles mixed in with fantasy and martial arts and romance. Very ambitious. The West only had great sitcoms like Three's Company and MASH, but it didn't have any of these epic action shows like Hong Kong and Japan did back then. And stuff like John Woo's films where it wasn't even about the quantity of action but the quality. How he's able to build the moment by building the energy and the characters leading up to the moment, so just that moment when they take out their guns and they're aiming at each other, that's already something big. It's very much like Akira Kurosawa actually, that's how he built up action, and then of course a lot of Western films in the 1960s like the Fistful of Dollars trilogy and Magnificent Seven copied Kurosawa. Woo pretty much took some of Kurosawa and turned it into his own. Heck, even George Lucas was influenced by those older Japanese samurai films when he made Star Wars, hence why he called it a space western, and Darth Vader's armor being quite similar to a samurai's armor. That makes sense. So what about the new Street Fighter 6 game? Did you try it yet? Yup. I'm done with that game. Garbage game. It got high marks from reviewers because reviewers just look at how many new features a game adds without actually playing it competitively. Street Fighter 6 is unbalanced. The core gameplay is very similar to Street Fighter 5, a game that reviewers and casuals didn't like but was actually a very balanced game. 6. Added in drive impact, which is really stupid casual spammy shit. They also added back the parry from Street Fighter 3, which is fine, but they also made it way too easy to pull off just like the drive impact, and on top of that they took away chip damage. Before, if you blocked a fireball or any special move, you still lose a little bit of life. But now they completely removed losing health on a block. And you factor in a super easy parry and the timing is too easy, it pretty much makes fireballs useless. Especially when all the new characters already have a bunch of moves that goes through under or over fireballs. So doing fireballs is often more of a disadvantage than an advantage. And the drive impact is stupid as shit. It's an op version of Street Fighter 4's Focus Attack. Which is another overrated game, by the way. Street Fighter 4 is also a game that's friendly to casuals because of how easy it is to spam shit, and because everyone liked the Marvel vs Capcom style casual spam and simplified fighting style, they added that into. But yeah, the drive impact goes through near everything, and rushes you forward, and it's super easy to do. Just press 2 buttons. And if you activate it, you'll go right through attacks and fireballs and knock the other guy dizzy, and allow you to do another super combo or super move on the guy, and it only uses 1 bar from the drive gauge. There's 6 bars on there and your drive gauge comes back up fast. Which means in 1 round you can literally just spam that dumb move. Pretty stupid decision. Reviewers of course all love the game cause they're all casuals and they like to copy each other's reviews. And since initially reviews are positive, everyone's just going to jump on the bandwagon with glowing reviews. It's like those dumb 8-bit controllers who everyone online loves. Just because a few casuals think it's nice to play Super Mario World with doesn't mean the controller is actually good. The pad is literally defective and doesn't register correctly and useless for all but the most basic games. The Hori-fied pad's pad is much better, but since Hori didn't pay off any online influencers like 8-bit did, everyone judges the Hori controllers much more harshly and nobody gives it a chance as a result. But yeah, core gameplay is solid, but it's a bit ruined by the retarded drive impact bullshit. And the lack of chip damage on block and super easy parries. So it turned the game one-dimensional. Distance game is useless now cause the other person can just stand back and block everything for free. Cause they don't lose health when they block fireballs or special moves or supers. So no more range game or zoning game anymore, because fireballs are useless and do no harm, so no more zoning and trapping game. Also you are left more vulnerable if you even throw a fireball. Cause all the new characters have 2 or 3 moves that goes right through a fireball to hit you, and drive impact goes right through a fireball and stuns you for a super combo. So yeah, zoning and distance game both gone because of these retarded Super Smash Bros. Style casual additions. Street Fighter is supposed to be for hardcore players, not for casuals who want to play Marvel vs Capcom or Super Smash Bros. With super powerful easy to pull off special moves. Now the only way to play is to get a bit closer, then throw out some random one-hit poke attack, but you don't want to link that to any combo because they can just drive impact you and stun you for a super move, so if you throw out more than one punch to try to link a combo, you can get hit by a drive impact, which is super easy to do. Only time you throw a combo is if you hit first, but you can't make them block your combo because they'll drive impact. And you can't counter a drive impact if you're in mid combo. So you're 100% sitting duck if you try to throw a combo and the other opponent blocked the first hit. So now it's just fighting in close or mid-range and try to do a one-off poke and be careful to look out if anyone does the drive impact. But don't try to do combos too much, don't do fireballs, just stand close or mid-range, poke a bit, throw a bit and watch out for drive impact. Really stupid. It's like Mario Tennis, you know how they just added that super move and you just activate it by pressing 2 buttons, and that triangle button allows you to fly halfway across the screen to recover. But at least Mario Tennis you can say is made for casuals. Capcom added this bullshit in to dumb things down to attract more casuals to play, just like Street Fighter 4. And throwing in these retarded modern controls just trying to sell out and addict as many casuals and noobs as possible while killing a lot of the main experience for real players. If you even watch Daigo and all of them when playing now, they are just doing what I said. Don't get overzealous on the combos, and just throw out one random hits cause you need to be careful of that godly drive impact which just requires pressing 2 buttons to activate, but the casual friendly drive impact no damage on the block and super easy parry. Capcom essentially by catering to the casual and Smash Bros fans, eliminated 2/3 RDS of the various ways to play in Street Fighter. They eliminated the zoning game and range game and fireball game and even the rush down combo game. The drive rush which they added can add a bit of more skill and execution for advanced players, cause it allows you to quick cancel out of a move to rush fast or link another move which we normally cannot do as long as it's well timed and double tap forward fast enough. That was good, but then all the other stuff was stupid. Drive impact, easy parries, and no damage on block. A shitload of moves that go over and under fireballs, you might as well just get rid of the fireball then cause you're literally penalizing players for throwing out a fireball and that character just cause Capcom thinks has a fireball they won't give them anything else. So yeah, it's like they want you to play like Tekken now, which I don't even mind that. You can make it like Tekken, but don't throw in a stupid casual drive impact thing cause that even ruins the flow if you want to play it like Tekken. Now people are just standing around not throwing punches and waiting to see if the guy will drive impact or not. And it's not like I'm losing. I'm in the top tier gold on my way to diamond, but I don't appreciate these rookie additions. Cause even if I'm winning by just always looking out for that stupid drive impact and then punishing people for doing it. So my experience of winning is just revolving around watching out for drive impact, bait, and punish. Instead of focusing on other stuff like zoning, spacing, combos and trapping. Whereas in a well-balanced game like Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which is the best version of Street Fighter, it was all about learning everything and balancing it out. All types of strategies could be learned and all of them had pros and cons. The problem with modern games like Street Fighter 6 and honestly most Western games is that they have unbalanced gameplay or gameplay that is way too easy. If you don't beat a game on the hardest difficulty, then in my opinion you have not played the game. That's why these reviewers never give high scores to games like Aliens Fireteam or Dynasty Warriors which are both very good games but because reviewers are casuals who are not good at them, they just play on easy or medium difficulty and say it is repetitive. But if they had played on hardest difficulty, they would be forced to learn the nooks and crannies to be able to beat the game. Same with those idiots online who review those 8-bit controllers, all casuals who don't really play. Reviewers will just play games on the lower difficulties and then say it's repetitive and won't give a game higher marks unless they add new features or new moves and stuff. But for me I don't care about adding new moves and features. I find that stuff makes the game too easy and too comical and not gritty enough. I'm more worried about the delicate fine balance of the gameplay. The intensity of the fighters and the scale of the battles which you'll only get if you play on the hardest difficulty and feel like you're fighting for your life. But often I find that developers don't properly balance the difficulties. Like in Elder Scrolls Oblivion, I played the game on the hardest difficulty from the start, but I found out the developers never meant to have anyone play the game on hardest from the beginning. I started out with nothing and spent hours in the sewer just trying to kill a rat. But I did it anyways. I spent hours killing rats on the hardest difficulty just to say I was able to play Oblivion on the hardest difficulty. That way I know how well balanced a game is. In Bethesda's case their games aren't very balanced. In the case of Dynasty Warriors 2, it was the hardest Dynasty Warriors, and I played the whole game solo on the hardest difficulty with a fresh character with no stat upgrades. It took me days and nights sometimes to get past one stage. No one in the world has done that. I might be the only person in the world who finished Dynasty Warriors 2 that way. Because when I talked about it on the Game FAQ's message board, nobody believed it could be done. On the entire message board for that game, after I gave them a detailed breakdown on how I did it, then some people said okay maybe in theory it might be possible. And Dynasty Warriors 2 was also way harder than all the later Dynasty Warriors because you had less moves and less stuff like your musemeter going up by itself when your health is in the red, there wasn't that shit back then. And I wasn't supposed to use a fresh new character to play on the hardest difficulty. The hardest difficulty was meant for someone who finished the game once and leveled up their character with gear and more health and power to play the hard level, so just like in Oblivion, I wasn't supposed to play the game on the hardest difficulty with a fresh character but I did it, and on top of that I didn't know that every stage had a permanent 10% health increase item you can find, so technically every stage you can boost your max health by 10%. But I didn't even know that, so I finished the whole game on hardest with default max health, which is like a very short health bar. Enemy generals were killing me with 1 or 2 hits by the second or third stage. Also you cannot save anytime you want, you only had one save for the whole entire stage, so it's literally do or die for me every time. Modern games are far too simplistic in gameplay and focus too much on the story instead of the gameplay. And modern gamers are a bunch of pussies who need games to be dumbed down in difficulty, else they won't have enough patience to play it. Reviewers will also give a game bad marks if they are too difficult or don't have a good story, so it forces modern games to be this way just to get a better score from critics. Or if a game is too complex for them, like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which was one of the first games to combine tactical strategy, real-time strategy, resource management all in one game. If I wanted a good story I'd watch a movie instead of playing a game. It goes back to the arcade scene. Arcade games were meant to be difficult and punishing because they were meant to force players to give up their quarters easily, but because of that they focused on the gameplay more, and it actually forced players to get better and more skilled in order to get farther in the game on limited credits. And I'm not talking about just the great fighting games like Street Fighter 2 and King of Fighters, but also games like Warriors of Fate, and Capcom Dungeons and Dragons, Ghouls and Ghosts, Final Fight, 1944, Forgotten Realms, Legendary Wings, Saturday Night Slam Masters, Knights of the Round, Alien vs Predator, Simpsons, Punisher, Cadillacs, and Dinosaurs, all the shooters and light gun games and stuff. Like a simple example of balanced gameplay, is Capcom's Dungeons and Dragons beat 'em up, probably the greatest beat 'em up ever. I might be surrounded by enemies, one on each side of me, they tail me so I can't get to one side of them. So instead I can do a fireball motion and jump, which executes a slide move depending on how far the enemy is from me. The harder and longer I press the button after the quarter circle move decides how far I slide. When I slide I can evade the enemy and their projectiles, so I know the enemies not only stabs me with the sword, but once I get to a distance they can also throw rocks or shoot arrows at me, so I decided to do a quarter circle motion short slide, just enough to land right behind the enemy in my right where I can still hit it, but I can also combo that attack to a quarter circle fireball attack where I'll combo into a sweeping slice attack. And can also hit the other enemy that was originally behind me that's a bit farther to keep him from shooting an arrow at me from distance. This is just one small example of a game back then that was well balanced and one moment, and I'm not even talking about bosses mixed with these guys and the comboing of melee with casting my spells too and the timing of when to cast. In order to juggle, and then I see some modern games and it's just flashy looking action, but I'm just mashing one button and then I have to just press a button I see on the screen like in God of War. It's such an evolution in gameplay mechanics. I mean, you can add a motion for a special move if they wanted, but gameplay has gotten more dumbed down cause most people suck at doing skilled inputs. My friend can't even do a single fireball motion slide or slash in that game if his life depended on it, so imagine needing to do it in a split-second clutch time within just a few frames out of 60 frames in order to evade a boss dragon's claws. I can beat Street Fighter 2 Turbo on the hardest difficulty, and on the American version as well. Justin Wong and even Daigo and the others I saw couldn't do that. Or even if they did, it was on the Japanese version of Street Fighter 2, and the AI on the Japanese version is widely considered to be easier than the AI on the American version. Japanese AI is like level 4 on the American version, which is level 8. And Daigo was very scared of a few characters like Zangief along the way. He wanted to do it without losing to get Akuma out, and it took him maybe a few days or weeks to do it. And he did it on the easier Japanese version. Also, Daigo might not have even played it on the hardest difficulty on the Japanese version because in his video he didn't say which difficulty, so chances are he was only playing it on the default difficulty. That's like level 2 out of 8 on the American version. Most seasoned Street Fighter 2 players can't even beat the first character in the game on the hardest. My friend who likes fighting games tried for 2 hours to beat the first character and he couldn't do it. So yeah, I can beat it on hardest, and also back in the day in my prime I fought the world number 2 ranked Street Fighter 2 player Afro Legends to a standstill, and I did it using a crappy Xbox 360 controller. Afro Legends of course probably had a fancy fighting stick and I still fought him to a standstill. I could probably have beat even Daigo back then if I had a proper fighting stick or fighting pad. Hi, my name is Tong. And don't talk to me about Mortal Kombat or Marvel vs Capcom or Super Smash Bros. Those are just fighting games toned down for casuals to play. Especially Smash, because one button triggers a special move. You don't need the precise timing combinations for moves like in Street Fighter. Mortal Kombat's gameplay was always mediocre and not true high-tier mechanics. It's not much better than Smash, just casuals see the gory gameplay and fatalities and get attracted to it. Typical Western approach, style over substance. They don't focus on the gameplay as much as Japanese games, and Mortal Kombat is just what you expect when a Western company makes a fighting game, all about the graphics and gore, instead of deep engaging gameplay. Tekken is more interesting. Tekken's type of gameplay is more casual friendly, but there's also room to play high level too, cause you don't have to do special moves like fireballs and stuff as much in Tekken, so casuals can just button mash and still have fun, but there's also high level tactics in it if you want to get better, so Tekken is cool in that sense. Most 3D fighting games are like this. Virtua Fighter is like this too. Back in 1991, Street Fighter 2 skill level was so high that even now, people surprise all the pros by finding new tactics with everyone thought were shitty characters. And it's a 35-year-old game now, but you can tell Capcom put crazy attention into the game. The feeling of weight behind how the characters move. Like each character, just the way they move, you can feel a weight behind it. There's substance. If you use a big guy, he feels like a bigger guy when you move. With most other games it's just the character model that looks big, but he feels like the same weight as smaller characters when you move, like it'll feel floaty. But with Street Fighter 2, down to the feel of the crouching medium kick or a dragon punch, you feel weight behind the move and the design of small details of the move down to the frame for timing of execution. Stuff like Mortal Kombat is simple, you block and it blocks, and the attention to detail down to the frame of each move isn't there. Like say everyone's crouching medium kick would be the same with the same frames. Whereas in Street Fighter 2 each character's crouching medium kick have different frames, different speed and priority and different reach and different damage, and will link differently, and this is just one crouching medium kick. That's how fine-tuned Street Fighter 2 was. Kind of shows why it was so mind-blowing when it was released. That level of skill that can be obtained was unheard of in video game history at that point. Modern music is all trash and overproduced garbage. There's no musicianship in modern produced pop music. It's all stuff that someone else composed and wrote, and electronic sampled beats everywhere. This started happening in the 90s when you start hearing manufactured music like Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys. There's no comparison to music of older generations. You go back to the 1940s and 1950s and there's all these great jazz musicians like Nina Simone and Charlie Parker and Chet Baker, who are all better live than in the studio by the way, since they know how to improvise well live and all their music has a sense of soul when they perform. Then in the 1960s and 1970s you had the classic rock bands like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, the greatest songwriter of all time in Bob Dylan, the most innovative and creative guitarist ever in Jimi Hendrix, very creative artists like David Bowie and Frank Zappa and even more low-key artists like Donovan all wrote and composed their own music and had so much innovation and creativity. However, Queen and AC/DC are overrated. Queen has more simplistic sounding stuff and AC/DC is just one facet of Led Zeppelin, which is the straight-ahead rock riffs. In the 1980s music was still good. You had these glam rock bands like everyone kind of dismissed like Bon Jovi and stuff, but they were still quite creative and their songwriter was deep and insightful. And the 80s, although full of technical shredders, still at least had a high level of skill with their instruments. Even the pop music in the 80s wasn't overproduced like today's music. You listen to Michael Jackson or George Michael or Elton John or Prince or even Madonna, they co-wrote or fully wrote their songs and their music still had a lot of depth and charm in them. Starting from the 90s both the pop music scene and rock music scene went downhill. Pop music because it became overproduced and over-commercialized. And rock music because Nirvana was overrated and caused a bunch of bands to copy them with their emo depressing lyrics and simplistic sounding compositions. And of course, as mentioned, 90s movies all sucked except for dramas. The only good thing about 90s was the high watermark set by Japanese video games like Street Fighter and the all-time great sitcoms like Friends and Seinfeld. And unlike today, back then if you played video games you were considered cool, especially games in the arcade like Street Fighter. Everyone was coming out to play versus in Street Fighter in the arcades back then, even gangsters, cause they viewed it like a sport. The kids who weren't jocks are normally more shy. They don't like direct competition, especially with the crowd watching and money's on the line and the guy you're facing is right beside you rubbing elbows and that pressure. I noticed the non-jocks types can't handle that. Different mindset, but they still loved the game so they would go watch. The regular arcades were rough areas with bullies and shit and smokers cause they had pool tables mixed in there too. In my area back then there was an arcade every 3 blocks. Even Burger King had Street Fighter. And of course all 7-Elevens and every single mom and pop corner store had arcade machines too, and at least one of those machines is always Street Fighter 2. And Chinese pharmacies had them too. Every nook and corner of the mall had one. Back then during the whole arcade craze there really wasn't a stigma at all with playing games. It wasn't looked at as nerdy back then. It's like in Karate Kid where they went on a date to that fun center and they had mini golf, arcades, go-kart, pool, pinball, air hockey, etc. It's the PC gaming crowd that eventually made gaming look nerdy, because games on PCs tend to be the more nerdy type games like D&D, MMORPGs, and point-and-click adventure games and simulation games and stuff tend to be looked on as more nerdy games. Whereas consoles back then you could be playing Street Fighter, or other cool games like Sonic or Contra or Castlevania. So PC gamers were seen as the stay-at-home type. Arcade gamers never carried that stigma, cause normally arcade gamers are going for competition or just hanging out. Like in that Simpsons episode where Homer was playing Bart in that boxing game and Homer kept getting his ass kicked, then he went to the arcade to find a kid who was super good at the game to teach his son a lesson. In that episode the kid in the arcade, they drew him as a cool kid wearing shades and street smarts who could handle himself. That's sort of the way the arcade scene was like back then. People were hanging out with grown-ups smoking and shit and with gangsters and bullies, and you're there playing games and competing and winning and you need street smarts to survive cause it's rough in some arcades. And arcade games were seen as less nerdy, especially Street Fighter which was viewed as a sport. It attracted all the jocks and gangsters and everyone to compete. There were 24-hour arcades with adults and gangsters smoking and shit with bullies and stuff, and you go in there and kick ass competing with them in the middle of the night. Back in the arcades I got into some fights, some of my friends got bullied and slapped. I remember when I was 10 or 11 and went into this shitty hole in the wall arcade once and I was trying to learn Street Fighter and I had 1 quarter and it was this shitty place with bullies and dropouts everywhere, and there was this dumb big fat grown up man child bully who was probably 17 or 18 and he came over and stole my game while I was playing. I was just there by myself and then this bully tried this stunt on this other kid next to me and ends up that kid has his older brother there playing another machine beside him, but the bully didn't know. He tried to take the kid's machine and that brother shouted at him and said he better watch it else they're gonna fight, and the bully backed off, and the bully was some white trash while the brother and kid were Asian. But after I got a bit older, like around 12 or 13, I got bigger and more willing to fight if need be, so at least I can handle myself a bit. I remember one time one of my friends got slapped hard by a way older kid cause he kept winning in Street Fighter cause everyone played Street Fighter back then. It was a sport like playing pool and competing. Adults, bullies, gangsters, jocks, everyone played. So my friend was like 12 and he kept beating these adults and one got fed up and shoved him, and then that guy and his buddy, 2 grown men, went up to slap him. And then another friend another time in another arcade was playing a big versus Street Fighter 2 game versus a neighborhood bully, and I was 13 years old and there was a crowd watching and the bully was shouting, "I'm fucking warning you, I'm down to my last quarter, you better not win," and my buddy still won, and then that bully got pissed and elbowed my buddy in the face. Then I ran over and tackled the bully guy and started punching him, and eventually the worker there had to break us up, and that worker was a Street Fighter 2 player too, and he was watching the game so he knew what was going on, so he kicked the bully out of the arcade, and after me and my friend eventually left, that bully and his buddy were waiting outside thinking of jumping my friend, but that bully saw me there too so they backed off cause I kind of beat up that bully guy once in school before too, and back then I was doing some Muay Thai already. So yeah, you really have to know how to handle yourself back then in the arcade scene, especially if you were gonna compete in fighting games with crowds watching and money on the line. That's sort of why there wasn't a nerdy stigma with arcade gamers back then. And for console gamers, they were viewed as a natural extension of the arcade and not related to PC and console gaming back then was viewed as a cool new novelty and everyone was interested in trying it, even girls were interested, hence less stigma. But now gaming isn't considered as a novelty, so I find the newer generations not all girls game, but back then with Nintendo and Super Nintendo it was this new hot thing everyone wanted to try, adults, boys and girls. That's why if you meet girls my age they would have recollections of playing the Nintendo and Super Nintendo. It was a new ubiquitous novelty thing everyone tried and the new neat thing that everyone was curious about, and consoles were viewed as an extension of the arcades. And with the marketing back then, like with Genesis, they would always show the cool kids playing. And I find on average PC gamers are the type that got more stigma because of the nature of those games. But PC games can get very deep, like those MMORPGs or Diablo or Elder Scrolls, and you end up never going outside since they are so immersive and the anti-social stigma develops. But yeah, for arcade gamers they were viewed as the cool kids who had street smarts. It was a different world back then. We had to fend for ourselves more compared to today's sheltered kids. Imagine going to a 24-hour arcade when you're in high school and it's packed like a nightclub, you can't move around and had to wade through crowds. And there's huge large TV screens for Street Fighter and other fighting games, and there's like 30 quarters in the machine, tons of people lining up waiting to play, and it's like midnight and everyone's smoking. There's all these Vietnamese gangsters hanging out and they had so much cash and were all great fighting game players. There's bullies from all walks of life and you're a high school kid and you're winning like crazy, cause back then I was 13 or 14 and already super good at fighting games. I was already Daigo level back then and never lost. I would be at these 24-hour arcades in the middle of the night and massive crowds like a nightclub all surrounding me and watching me play. Huge 80-inch screens for each machine. And I wouldn't lose for 2 or 3 hours all night. Everyone was lining up to play me, but half of these people were like gangsters and shit, they were smoking and had knives. I remember one dude flashed a gun hidden in his coat, no idea if it was real or not, but they all had knives for sure, so you had to really be able to handle yourself. And like with bullies, sure you can fight, but with Vietnamese gangsters you need to watch out cause they're in a pack and have knives, so you can't fight that. Instead it's more about respect and building street cred and just being cool to the point where they just respect you. It's like this whole other underworld thing, and you had pool tables and pinball there and everyone smoking and shit. They would even reference it in that anime High Score Girl. The main character would hang out at arcades and there's always a huge crowd around the Street Fighter machines, and he'd think to himself, as usual the Street Fighter machines all swarmed by crowds, cause back then Street Fighter 2 owned 50 to 60% of the arcade market, and that's just official numbers, doesn't even include all the knockoff machines which were mostly Street Fighter 2 machines. At the major arcades the crowd was so thick watching the competition on those large machines it's like a nightclub, so you need to weave between crowds to get to the machine to put your quarters up. Amazing thing is, for some reason I've never seen any mix up with whose quarter was whose and whose turn it was when you had 20 to 30 quarters on a machine waiting. The main event area had about 4 to 5 fighting game machines, and at least 3 of them would be Street Fighter 2 and sometimes all of them would be. Sometimes they might put a new game on just for one machine and they all had like 70-inch displays against the wall. That way when it's a huge packed crowd everyone can see the action, and you'd have the beat MUPS in another area and a section for pool tables. The pressure playing in those situations was palpable. You can feel the buzz in the air, people knowing who's who. Interesting. Didn't know the arcades back then were so seedy and dangerous. Yes, it was a different world back then. You were too young to know, because by the time of the late 90s the arcade scene died down and children's cartoons were less gritty and more childish, and video games in general started to focus more on story rather than gameplay. Not to mention by the 90s the pop music turned to trash. In the 80s there were genuinely great pop singer-songwriters like Elton John and George Michael and Michael Jackson, and even Madonna wrote a few of her own songs. But in the 90s it turned into that Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears crap. This also applies to video games. I find that most Japanese video games are very complete when they are shipped. Very few bugs or issues on release, and a lot of them, like Japanese RPGs, have 100 or more hours of content in the base game without any DLC. And even when there is DLC, it is usually just for cosmetic or small stuff like skins or items. Compare this to Western video game developers who try to nickel and dime and milk consumers all the time. How many times has GTA 5 and Skyrim been re-released again? Didn't Last of Us get like 3 different versions all within the span of less than 10 years? And also the fact that they often are released in a buggy or unfinished state. Just take a look at some of the stuff Bethesda or Activision or EA or Ubisoft or Blizzard has come out with. AAA games like Cyberpunk 2077 shipped with massive bugs. Hell, Skyrim for PS3 shipped with a version that was basically unplayable. And to add on to that, a lot of these games, especially the ones from Activision and EA, ship with an empty shell of a game and expect you to buy a season pass so that they can milk you more for DLCs, which are basically stuff that should have been included in the main game. See, that's bullshit. Japanese companies usually ship games complete and polished. Western developers will try to milk people as much as they can. Just keep re-releasing the same games, ship them half-baked and incomplete, and shove DLC down your throat and try to get as much money out of you as possible. And although Western games are good at the open world aspects, they often feel very empty, compared to Japanese games like Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild and Yakuza, which fill the space with things to do. Different mindsets, and everyone saying about how 8-bit the controllers is good enough for Mario doesn't understand my point here. If a controller is good enough for Street Fighter 2, then it's good enough for any game. Because Street Fighter requires split-second timing and execution. And what you have to recognize is that Street Fighter 2 isn't just an iconic arcade game, it's actually a cultural phenomenon. It's transcendent. Like Michael Jordan or the Beatles. Even now, they have magazines dedicated to Street Fighter 2. It was a cultural landscape that went beyond gaming. Street Fighter 2 literally revived the entire arcade gaming industry. It led to every mom and pop store, convenience store, 7-Eleven, laundromats, everywhere had a Street Fighter 2 machine. I know because I was there. You were too young to know. Comics and movies came out very soon after its release. We're not talking about 20 years after, they came out right away. You had Hong Kong comics based on Street Fighter, Hong Kong variety shows which did an episode on Street Fighter 2. There is a variety show in Hong Kong that normally only invites movie stars and singers for interviews, and they hauled in 2 Street Fighter 2 arcade cabinets to let tournament players play, and the actors and everyone were talking about it. That's unheard of. Not to mention there was a Street Fighter 2 movie where Jackie Chan dressed up as Chun-Li, and it led to revival and resurgence of the arcade scene after it was dying down in the late 80s. After it came out, 40% of their cabinets were Street Fighter 2. Well, what about Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Mario, Doom, Sonic, Zelda, Pokemon, Tetris? Arguably they could be considered as popular, right? No, not even close. Street Fighter 2 is not comparable to any other video game at its peak. Space Invaders and Pac-Man were popular for its time, but they never reached the level of cultural phenomenon Street Fighter reached. Doom and Sonic is not even close. Especially Sonic, as it didn't change the gaming industry as much as the others, it was just Mario but faster. Zelda and Tetris never had same impact outside of gaming. Only Mario and Pokemon have somewhat of an argument, but Mario was more of a long-time impact, it never had the immediate impact on popular culture Street Fighter 2 did. Pokemon got a boost from the anime and card games and all the merchandising that Nintendo did. Street Fighter didn't need an anime and card games to explode in popularity. It was unique and special. I was there. You never lived through the arcade scene since you were too young, so you don't know how big of a deal it was. It was huge. There were large lineups in every arcade just to have a chance to play someone at Street Fighter 2. It literally completely changed the gaming landscape forever. For the first time in video game history you could go head to head against someone and compete against them, and it was all about skills. I'm not talking about Pong where it's got very simplistic gameplay. Street Fighter 2 was easy to learn and hard to master. Proof of how popular and huge Street Fighter 2 was is that every year it kept getting upgraded to new versions. No other game would you have that many updates in that short of a time. In fact, just look up the statistics. Pac-Man sold about 400,000 arcade units worldwide. And there were no knockoff pirated versions of Pac-Man. But Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition alone sold 200,000 units by itself. Then Street Fighter 2 Turbo came out 10 months later as an update. And then came Super and Super Turbo editions after that. In total, just the legit versions of Street Fighter 2 might have sold double that of Pac-Man, and that's not counting the pirated versions. Many countries sold pirated versions of Street Fighter 2 cabinets. Just Mexico alone had 200,000 pirated units of Street Fighter 2. I saw it everywhere. All those mom and pop stores owned by Asians likely had pirated versions of Street Fighter 2. By 1991, Taiwan made 150,000 pirated units. Just one of the Hong Kong companies I knew was making 3,000 pirated machines each month. It's hard to put into words how big it was. You had to be there. How much money it raked in for the coin-op business everywhere, corner stores and arcades. And laundromats, and nobody really knows the true number of Street Fighter 2 cabinet units sold because of all the pirated versions and the lack of tracking data back then. Pac-Man never had a cabinet in every store or shop, even abandoned ones that I saw. I saw Street Fighter 2 machines in every 7-Eleven, laundromat, pharmacy shop, theater entrance, and in some arcades half of the cabinets would be Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter 2 accounted for 60% of the arcade business at its height. That's not even including counterfeits. And because it was a versus game, people were putting in quarters way faster than any arcade game before or since, cause it was addictive like drugs, the money was so good. And you'll see huge crowds everywhere around a Street Fighter 2 machine. Rolls of quarters waiting in line to play as people play versus, and matches only last 30 seconds to 1 minute max and next quarter in. It literally changed the arcade scene overnight. And you have to understand that the arcade scene in the early 90s was huge. It was bigger than the console market and obviously the gaming PC market, since that was in its infancy back then. Street Fighter 2 brought in people of all ages, all races, everyone from old grandmas to 8-year-old kids wanted a chance to play it. Another reason I know counterfeit machines were everywhere was because my classmate used to own a corner store 2 blocks from my house, and they would have 2 arcade machines, and one was always Street Fighter 2 and the other was Neo Geo. They cooperate with this coin-op service company who sends an employee to come update the machines and change the boards, and they said these are the Taiwan ones, and the same employee I would often see him updating all the other machines in other laundromats and corner stores around town. Also, you can tell which ones are counterfeit because for a while it was a trend to tweak the Street Fighter 2 game, and they would tweak the game to make it play faster or make you do moves faster. Also, in North America they don't use Japanese sticks, they use hapsticks. I grew up on hapsticks and those are my preference, and most of the old Street Fighter 2 players who grew up here, like John Choi, who was one of the early tournament players, we all loved using hapsticks. But the problem was that no home arcade sticks ever using hap were released. Because hapsticks are much larger and the internals are much bulkier. So because it was too big, no companies ever made a home hapstick. However, because all of us old school players used hapsticks, there was a private customer stick builder in California who made custom fight sticks with the hapsticks and North American buttons, and that brand was called Moss. They're a bit of a legend in the North American fighting game community amongst us old heads, but that custom builder died recently in a car accident with his wife, and the original company who made the hapsticks went out of business. There's another company who makes hapsticks now, but I heard that they suck. But back to my original point, is back in the 90s these counterfeit makers would make tweaked versions of Street Fighter II machines which were everywhere. They made ones that played the same as the originals, and they also made tweaked ones where you could shoot a million fireballs at the same time, or your dragon punch will fly across the screen, or you can do faster hurricane kicks in the air, so you know these are not legit. But you see, in the 1990s I saw these machines everywhere, a good portion in laundromats, corner stores and other places, even shady arcades. So these counterfeit machines were rampant. And that's just the ones where you know for sure it was counterfeit cause it was tweaked. There's also ones that play like the real thing. And this is just in Vancouver, where Capcom does sell real units too. But the impact of how big Street Fighter II is and how many units it sold cannot be accurately shown with stats, because the amount of Street Fighter II cabinets out there, both legit and counterfeit, were in the millions for sure, and tracking was unreliable in the 90s. And because these tweaked versions of Street Fighter II were so rampant, Capcom knew about it too, and Capcom actually took inspiration from these tweaked versions to make their official update now known as Street Fighter II Turbo. And they also got the idea from the fake versions about doing special moves mid-air and added that to the game later, which just shows you how rampant the counterfeiting was. Pac-Man and Space Invaders can't compare, since they didn't have this many counterfeit machines made, nor did they have the impact outside of gaming. And furthermore, Street Fighter II was the reason why Super Nintendo was able to gain a lead in the console wars. Because being able to play Street Fighter II at home at the time was huge. Street Fighter II came out for Super Nintendo first before it came out on Sega Genesis. And back in the day, gamers all knew that Street Fighter II was coming out for Super Nintendo, so when choosing between Genesis or Super Nintendo, of course they would choose Super Nintendo. And Mortal Kombat for Genesis came out later and was never as popular as Street Fighter II worldwide anyway, since Midway was the only American arcade developer making fighting games at the time. The fighting game industry, you'll notice, is dominated by Japanese companies like Capcom and SNK. And plus the gameplay of Street Fighter II takes more skill and is more polished compared to Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat used the gimmick of having realistic-looking characters and those gory fatality moves to sell the game, but the core fighting gameplay of Mortal Kombat is very shallow in comparison. So when we finally owned Street Fighter II on Super Nintendo, that was life-changing. And in the beginning I couldn't afford the cartridge cause a lot of shop owners jacked up the price on it, so me and my buddy had to chip in to rent it for a weekend. For people like me who first witnessed and played it in arcades, to have it finally released on home console was a divine moment. But it wasn't particularly close for Street Fighter II vs Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat is more of a North American thing, whereas Street Fighter II was global. It's not like with the next console generation it was Virtua Fighter 2 on Sega Saturn vs Tekken on PlayStation. But Sega's background in arcade games like Daytona, Sega Rally, Manx TT, and Virtua Cop led to me getting the Saturn. Ultimately PlayStation won because it had a lot more support from game developers, and Sega really messed things up with their infighting between the USA and Japanese divisions. But yeah, Capcom choosing to release Street Fighter II on Super Nintendo was like Jordan choosing Nike or Beatles choosing to use Vox amplifiers. It was a huge boost for Nintendo. You don't know because you were too young. I was there in the arcade scene early on. I witnessed the arcade scene evolve from Space Invaders and Pac-Man to Galaga and Joust and Gauntlet, and then Final Fight and Double Dragon, and then finally Street Fighter II, which was like Beatlemania. You go into any convenience store, pharmacy store, any dingy corner of a mall, gas station, laundromat, even Burger King or 7-Eleven. Even some US chain stores that had nothing to do with gaming had to put a Street Fighter II cabinet in there, which speaks volumes about its impact and popularity. Cause it was like legally selling cocaine to people back then. My grandma would hear the sounds of Street Fighter and she would go, "It's that again." Street Fighter II literally changed the world, both gaming and outside gaming. Think about it, without Street Fighter II we wouldn't have any of the fighting games people know. Mortal Kombat, King of Fighters, Darkstalkers, Marvel vs Capcom, Soul Calibur, Tekken, Virtua Fighter, Guilty Gear, Toshinden, which by the way was a really cool underappreciated early fighting game for PlayStation, but later entries sucked, and allowed Capcom and SNK to keep making stuff like Metal Slug and Devil May Cry later on. We would have lost a whole generation of 90s arcade games along with an entire video game genre if it wasn't for Street Fighter II revitalizing things. Even Beat 'em Ups got a resurgence in the early 90s thanks to Street Fighter II. Would SNK have Sengoku? Would Capcom have Warriors of Fate? Those Ninja Turtles beat 'em ups? It brought about a renaissance for the arcade scene and delayed the console dominance just a bit longer. I've never seen so many shops like convenience stores, laundromats, Burger Kings, 7-Eleven have arcade games, and when I did it was only Street Fighter II. They were everywhere. Around my house there were 4 convenience stores and all of them had Street Fighter II. In Japan, Super Nintendo would have beat Sega Genesis anyways because Super Nintendo already came out of the gates outselling Genesis. Super Mario was much more popular than Sonic in Japan. Sonic was always an American phenomenon. The decision to pack in Sonic as the bundled game for Sega Genesis really helped Genesis regain the lead in North America, but that was Sega USA and CEO Tom Kalinsk's only good decision. The book Console Wars would have you believe that Tom Kalinske and Sega USA were the victims and it was all Sega Japan's fault why Sega failed, but the truth of the matter is that most of the failures were because of Sega USA. The Sega 32X, which was one of the biggest Sega mistakes, was all Sega USA's decision because they wanted a console to satisfy players while they were waiting for Sega Saturn to come out. Of course people weren't going to buy Sega 32X if the Sega Saturn was just on the horizon though. Then when the Sega Saturn got announced, it was a surprise announcement and had an earlier release than expected, which surprised a lot of the video game developers and turned them off and away from Sega, and also Sony had less royalty fees anyways. Then it was Sega USA's fault for not marketing the Saturn that well as a competitor to the PlayStation. And of course there was no new Sonic game for the Saturn. Saturn ended up being decently popular in Japan, but it totally failed in North America and the PlayStation just killed it. The Dreamcast was too little too late at that point, as Sega had lost so much support and trust from developers and consumers alike. And most of that blame I would say is actually on Sega USA, not Sega Japan. But yeah, in North America, Street Fighter II definitely helped Super Nintendo regain the market share lead compared to Genesis. Street Fighter II was such a sensation that back in the day it was the first game that was able to tweak the game a bit and resell it to consumers, and it would sell like crazy again. There was no other game I could think of in that time that could just resell a game with minor revisions and sell it as a new game, not get any hate for it and pull it off successfully. And games like some Romance of the Three Kingdoms games are just as good a gaming experience as any game ever released. And personally I had way more fun playing a Romance of Three Kingdoms game than any Last of Us game, since Last of Us and Uncharted are all cinematics and story and the gameplay experience is not the focus and leaves a lot to be desired. The games which really changed my life are Final Fantasy IV, Dynasty Warriors 3, Diablo 2, Romance of Three Kingdoms, Street Fighter 2, Resident Evil 1, Doom, Oblivion, Dead Rising 1 and Left 4 Dead 1. Because later Dynasty Warriors lacked the balance in gameplay Dynasty Warriors 3 had. Later Street Fighter games lacked the balance 2 had, except for maybe 5. Street Fighter 3 added the parry which I didn't like, and Street Fighter 4 is spammy garbage for casuals, and Street Fighter 6 is also garbage because of the drive impact, making the gameplay very unbalanced. And games like Herzog's Way and Romance of Three Kingdoms count as early Japanese real-time strategy games. Everyone says Western companies make all the real-time strategy games like Age of Empires and StarCraft and Dune 2, but actually people forget Herzog's Way and Romance came out way before any of those games. Japanese just decided not to focus on that genre, but they did pioneer the genre. And Romance of the Three Kingdoms is also a tactical game too. But where I know you don't play Romance of the Three Kingdoms is because you think they are similar, but every romance game is totally different. Some romance games are real-time strategy like StarCraft and others are tactical like XCOM and Advance Wars. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 2 for Nintendo is a mix of both. There's SimCity aspects where you manage different cities, and when you go to war, it's tactical on a grid like Fire Emblem or Advance Wars. Other romance games had civilization-style city building, and that's only half of the game. The earlier Nintendo Romance of Three Kingdom games were full tactical on a grid when you go into battle like Final Fantasy Tactics, except it came out way earlier. And also had diplomatics and espionage. So they aren't totally different from games like StarCraft, Warcraft, Total War, and also they can be similar to SimCity, Civilization, and also similar to XCOM and Final Fantasy Tactics too. Depending on which game, all are very different. And how you build your units pre-war, commanders and sub-captains and number of troops, which affects what tactics your units can deploy, and they have unit war tactics and personal tactics and ploys and one-on-one duel tactics, and this is just the battle part, which is 1/3 of the game. And Romance takes even more time than SimCity to play. One turn might take hours. One full game of Romance might take days. It's like 3 games in one. City building, military building, and personnel management and diplomacy and espionage, and then the war part, which is tactical or hybrid real-time strategy, and then you have the RPG element cause it's based off of story in real history with so many characters and you unlock stuff from the story. And the Japanese developer of Romance, Koei Tecmo, really did their research, because according to the time you send out certain characters, they might or might not be able to have better chances of recruiting others. For example, if you sent out Liu Bei a little bit earlier, you might find Zhujiang in the northeast of China, since that's where he was living before Liu Bei found him in the novel, and he might be convinced to join Shu Han, Liu Bei's kingdom, and so depending on the time you might be able to get him earlier. That's the details that Koei Tecmo put in. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8 is the only one where you can play as an individual officer and serve the same ruler if we want, and it's co-op. It takes more time and is more difficult to play than most strategy games too. So there's the history aspect, RPG, politics, city building, espionage, army building, officer relationship building, personal searching and recruiting, and the war part, which is like another game. With Dynasty Warriors 3 though, I still don't see any modern game that gives the same experience. Dynasty Warriors 3 is perfection. 2-player split screen, difficulty is just right, moves and everything is well balanced. None of those other modern games gives the same experience as Dynasty Warriors 3. The newer Dynasty Warriors games don't have that perfect balance. They are either too easy or added too many flashy anime moves where now your character is in the air shooting shit. It lost the grit of earlier Dynasty Warriors games. The earlier Dynasty Warriors games, the rule set, move set, and difficulty is so well balanced that it played really gritty. The intensity was just right, but the new Dynasty Warriors games, cause they kept adding all these new moves that were exaggerated, I can just do a lot of those weird mid-air moves shooting shit out of my sword. It all comes down to the little things like how hard it is to level your bodyguards in Dynasty Warriors 3 is just right, the difficulty and intensity and grit versus how fast we can level and how fast our bodyguards level, where we're building a small mini bodyguard army just in time when we need it, It's little touches like this. So yeah, not just any hack and slash co-op game will do. Dynasty Warriors 3 and 4 are the best in the series for how I like to play. But yeah, these co-op TMO games are pretty ahead of their time cause they've been making them since the 1980s. Like the Officer RPG mode in Romance of Three Kingdoms 8, not the regular ruler mode, is pretty awesome. We create our own characters and we can travel around China, join kingdoms, or be our own ruler and level up our stats, meet other generals, building relationships, get promotions, find items and weapons to boost stats or give as gifts to build relationships and recruit. Like me and my buddy, we build up our character's relationship to be trusted, and it can go to oath brothers later on when you have a strong bond, and if you're in war fighting on the same side, if you are both beside the same enemy, if one launches an attack the other will automatically pull in a hit to help too, but only if your relationship is strong. It's pretty cool. So in terms of officer mode, 8 has been great, and what's great about Romance is each game is so different. It's like the difference between playing SimCity and Warcraft, like two totally different games from different companies. Newer games play a bit more like StarCraft with some civilization, and older ones some are a cross between SimCity and Final Fantasy Tactics, and you set the parameters for your characters and they attack on their own. And games like some Romance of the Three Kingdoms games are just as good a gaming experience as any game ever released. And personally, I had way more fun playing a Romance of Three Kingdoms game than any Last of Us game, since Last of Us and Uncharted are all cinematics and story, and the gameplay experience is not the focus and leaves a lot to be desired. The games which really changed my life are Final Fantasy IV, Dynasty Warriors 3, Diablo 2, Romance of Three Kingdoms, Street Fighter 2, Resident Evil 1, Doom, Oblivion, Dead Rising 1 and Left 4 Dead 1. Because later Dynasty Warriors lacked the balance in gameplay Dynasty Warriors 3 had. Later Street Fighter games lacked the balance 2 had, except for maybe 5. Street Fighter 3 added the parry, which I didn't like, and Street Fighter 4 is spammy garbage for casuals, and Street Fighter 6 is also garbage because of the drive impact, making the gameplay very unbalanced. And games like Herzog's Way and Romance of Three Kingdoms count as early Japanese real-time strategy games. Everyone says Western companies make all the real-time strategy games like Age of Empires and StarCraft and Dune 2, but actually people forget Herzog's Way and Romance came out way before any of those games. Japanese just decided not to focus on that genre, but they did pioneer the genre. And Romance of the Three Kingdoms is also a tactical game too. But where I know you don't play Romance of the Three Kingdoms is because you think they are similar, but every romance game is totally different. Some romance games are real-time strategy like StarCraft, and others are tactical like XCOM and Advance Wars. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 2 for Nintendo is a mix of both. There's SimCity aspects where you manage different cities, and when you go to war, it's tactical on a grid like Fire Emblem or Advance Wars. Other romance games had civilization-style city building, and that's only half of the game. The earlier Nintendo Romance of Three Kingdom games were full tactical on a grid when you go into battle like Final Fantasy Tactics, except it came out way earlier. And also had diplomatics and espionage. So they aren't totally different from games like StarCraft, Warcraft, Total War, and also they can be similar to SimCity, Civilization, and also similar to XCOM and Final Fantasy Tactics too. Depending on which game, all are very different. And how you build your units pre-war, commanders and sub-captains and number of troops, which affects what tactics your units can deploy, and they have unit war tactics and personal tactics and ploys and one-on-one duel tactics, and this is just the battle part, which is 1/3 of the game. And Romance takes even more time than SimCity to play. One turn might take hours. One full game of Romance might take days. It's like 3 games in one. City building, military building, and personnel management and diplomacy and espionage, and then the war part, which is tactical or hybrid real-time strategy, and then you have the RPG element cause it's based off of story in real history with so many characters and you unlock stuff from the story. And the Japanese developer of Romance Koei Tecmo really did their research, because according to the time you send out certain characters, they might or might not be able to have better chances of recruiting others. For example, if you send out Liu Bei a little bit earlier, you might find Zhujiang in the northeast of China, since that's where he was living before Liu Bei found him in the novel, and he might be convinced to join Shu Han, Liu Bei's kingdom, and so depending on the time you might be able to get him earlier. That's the details that Koei Tecmo put in. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8 is the only one where you can play as an individual officer and serve the same ruler if we want, and it's co-op. It takes more time and is more difficult to play than most strategy games too. So there's the history aspect, RPG, politics, city building, espionage, army building, officer relationship building, personal searching and recruiting, and the war part, which is like another game. With Dynasty Warriors 3 though, I still don't see any modern game that gives the same experience. Dynasty Warriors 3 is perfection. 2-player split screen, difficulty is just right, moves and everything is well balanced. None of those other modern games gives the same experience as Dynasty Warriors 3. The newer Dynasty Warriors games don't have that perfect balance. They are either too easy or added too many flashy anime moves where now your character is in the air shooting shit. It lost the grit of earlier Dynasty Warriors games. The earlier Dynasty Warriors games, the rule set, move set, and difficulty is so well balanced that it played really gritty. The intensity was just right, but the new Dynasty Warriors games, cause they kept adding all these new moves that were exaggerated, I can just do a lot of those weird mid-air moves shooting shit out of my sword. It all comes down to the little things like how hard it is to level your bodyguards in Dynasty Warriors 3 is just right, the difficulty and intensity and grit versus how fast we can level and how fast our bodyguards level, where we're building a small mini bodyguard army just in time when we need it. It's little touches like this. So yeah, not just any hack and slash co-op game will do. Dynasty Warriors 3 and 4 are the best in the series for how I like to play. But yeah, these Koei Tecmo games are pretty ahead of their time cause they've been making them since the 1980s. Like the Officer RPG mode in Romance of Three Kingdoms 8, not the regular ruler mode, is pretty awesome. We create our own characters and we can travel around China, join kingdoms, or be our own ruler and level up our stats, meet other generals, building relationships, get promotions, find items and weapons to boost stats or give as gifts to build relationships and recruit. Like me and my buddy, we build up our character's relationship to be trusted, and it can go to oath brothers later on when you have a strong bond, and if you're in war fighting on the same side, if you are both beside the same enemy, if one launches an attack the other will automatically pull in a hit to help too, but only if your relationship is strong. It's pretty cool. So in terms of officer mode, 8 has been great, and what's great about Romance is each game is so different. It's like the difference between playing SimCity and Warcraft, like two totally different games from different companies. Newer games play a bit more like StarCraft with some civilization, and older ones some are a cross between SimCity and Final Fantasy Tactics, and you set the parameters for your characters and they attack on their own. Like with Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8, which I am playing these days, they have an individual officer mode which you can play co-op. Like, do we want to be our own ruler or do we want to be an officer within a kingdom, and if they make us a governor it'll be different. And some Romance of the Three Kingdom games are another level in terms of complexity. Like, they'll have all the battlefield war stuff and city building, but there's also a strong RPG element too cause there's like 1,000 generals and characters and they all have complex relationships with each other, and you can develop relationships too that can affect so many things. Other strategy games like Total War and Civilization won't have this level of relationship type gameplay. It's sort of like if you know the history, like one example is there is one obscure character called Zhang Song, very ugly and unchanged arming dude. He has bad relationships with almost everyone, so if you use him to work on civil projects he might not get along with the other officer, and also if you want to recruit him or use him to mentor other characters it might be tough. The character has a very high int but low charm and is unlikable. However, Liu Bei is literally the only character that has good relationships with him. But then you can sort of cultivate it too, but if they don't naturally get along then it'll be harder to cultivate. Like, I consider myself as someone who knows the history inside and out, every little minute detail, and I can use all this knowledge in it cause the designers built all this in, which is cool. Like an example is Cao. Cao historically isn't his real name, he only became the godson of a powerful official named Cao. In order to get more power. But this was a long time ago before the main part of the story. His real name is Xiahe. So in the game both Cao and Xiahe's surname people have a family relationship with Cao. So for someone who doesn't know the history they would be playing and be like, how come I can't seem to recruit Xiahe done away from Cao cause they're actually family. But yeah, Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8 is such a great game. Cause it goes in depth about all the individual officer details, like you can play it as an RPG and travel around China and meet people and build relationships, and you can work on your own skills or form a kingdom or form a band or just go solo and travel around. Like, I'm trying to build a trusted relationship with Zhao Yun and Guan Yu. And hoping to build our relationship to become sworn oath brothers, and if we reach a certain level of relationship we aid each other more as well during attacks during battle and can teach each other our skills and tactics, and then go to the city building and army tech building, and then after that go to battle. Cause we're going through individual RPG and relationship building scope and then out to the macro strategy too. Like when playing a new game, I'm here developing my own skills but also building relationships, and then how do I switch this to the politics and espionage and spy schemes while I'm also traveling the country looking for talent and characters and items. Now I'm actually getting paid. I'm still not sure how I can get money when I'm not part of a kingdom, and then I try to work hard in developing the cities and army, and you can get rewards for it and rank up and stuff of course, but at the same time while doing this stuff, I can focus on building relationships. Like I wanted to be a governor of a state so I can have a bit of autonomy, and after years he only lets me be an advisor. Then of course on the battlefield you can gain merit too by doing well, and during this time with Liu Bei is so fun so far cause its single officer play mode is so in depth and I can suddenly switch and just be my own ruler, or if I'm a prefect or a warlord or advisor the menu is different and the things I can do. Like if I was a free general just roaming around China talking to people looking for talent, looking for items and building my fame, then suddenly I joined Liu Bei's kingdom to be an officer. Now the menus are different. Thing is, with Romance of the Three Kingdoms there will of course also be some aspects similar in terms of you still need to go to war and develop your cities and find and search for personnel and do relationship cultivation and develop weapons, but just the way they go about it each time is so different. The rules what you can do is not the same. It's a good thing, but sometimes when they have a good thing going, the next one can be so different. I built a strange relationship with Zhang Fei cause when he first hired me he wanted to test me and asked me to have a one-on-one duel with him, so it would load into a different one-on-one duel screen where we can control some options. I barely beat Zhang Fei even though he's rated higher in war, but then after that I built a strange friendly competitive relationship with him, and Zhang Fei would come visit me almost every month challenging me and competing with me on tasks and merits. Or sometimes if I visit him we just go hunting and then going to war, so there's many things where I wonder how does it work. Like how come when I'm attacking with my unit, depending on if it's cavalry or not, if Guan Yu's unit was close there was one battle every time I attacked with my unit he'd join in with his unit, maybe because I built a strong bond with him to the trusted level, but then next time it doesn't happen. Do we need to be using the same unit, or is it only certain attacks I use? Cause along with regular unit attack we each have special abilities like trample, rout, harass, charge etc. Do we need to have the same skill, and then in each special skill's efficiency is based on so many factors. My proficiency with it, my character's stats like war and leadership. Enemy general stats and proficiencies, the terrain I'm trying to execute it on, pretty interesting, but then so far one little thing I'm iffy on is when invading. If I can destroy the enemy gates to zero I win, even if their army is still intact. But in Romance of the Three Kingdoms 6 or 9 or 11, one of those ones, if we break into the city, battle isn't over yet. After breaking the city gates, we still gotta storm and enter the city and destroy and take over its core. I wish they had that aspect in part 8 because the version that had that aspect the defense can patrol the walls and drop boulders on invading units and stuff, but it also allows me to try to use tactics like challenge certain generals to duels, but then dueling was always a touchy topic cause in the novel dueling was such a huge aspect. The one-on-one duels between Guan Yu and Sei Huaziang, but then in a war or in the game if not done well it can be overpowered. And the rules are always different in each game, like some games if you win the duel then the entire general's unit is gone, but some other games the soldiers of that unit might merge with another unit, or sometimes one unit might have multiple generals so one unit still survives. Or the losing general sometimes can escape and flee, but it brings down unit morale. So far in 8 I hardly dueled. One thing about 8 that I like though is they figured out how to open and keep the battle in the open battlefield if that's what one side wants, cause in the past games I can run past everyone and rush the fort, but here they added a border and an outpost city, so if defending side chooses to fight on the battlefield we can't just pass that border to get into the castle but need to beat the defense on the field at the outpost city. I think that's a great addition, so we can't cheap out on the CPU, cause in some past games I can use espionage during my tactical monthly planning that somehow raises the enemy gates and brings down their enemy defense, then I build my tech up and develop battle rams and then I invade and just run past all their units to the gate and just battle ram the gate after I already use spy tactics to bring down the gate defense. It's cool here they can force us to stay out in the battlefield, but as a result we also lost the in-castle battle, like after breaking the gates the need to attack and take the core of the city before we win, would be nice if they had that too. But so far I think 8 is a very nice balance, like they created a 3 or 4 monthly cycle and only then can we do stuff like espionage tactics during the council meeting after 3 or 4 months, and depending on what rank or role I am, I have certain amounts of turns to do stuff during the council meeting, so that way I can't cheap out the CPU and use spy tactics non-stop, cause I'm only allowed 1 to 3 months to do that in the council for spy, diplomacy, military, invasion, certain personnel stuff, and then after that the monthly stuff is another screen where I can do the day-to-day operations of developing the city and the RPG elements like developing my character and relationship building or traveling the country to explore. And after I joined Liu Bei's faction, I built a trusted relationship with Guan Yu and a friendly competitive relationship with Zhang Fei, and Zhang Fei would come visit me each month and talk smack. After a while I got fed up cause Liu Bei never made me a prefect governor, so I resigned and chose to be a free official again, just roaming the lands, and then I can just build relationships with people, and when I feel the time is right, I can form my own band. But forming a band doesn't mean you're taking over a city. I can live in a controlled province ruled by another ruler, but I can have my band of allies with me, sort of like Robin Hood and his band of merry men, and we can secretly build our own small army like Outlaws of the Marsh being mountain bandits, and we can choose to move around the country too, but it gets annoying if we have to travel through occupied provinces. And then if we want, I can declare and take over an empty province if I think I'm strong enough, but yeah, the relationship stuff is very fun. Especially if you know the history a lot. If you play through as CAO and say if you wanted to recruit Guan Yu, it's super tough. Cause most of CAO's generals are antagonistic versus Liu Bei's side, especially the Xia and CAO generals. However, historically in CAO side, Zhang Liao is the only general to have a good relationship with Liu Bei, which dates back to before they were generals, so using Zhang Liao to talk to Guan might help. CAO and Guan also had a complex relationship, so sometimes Guan might be willing to listen to CAO for a bit. It's cool how the Japanese are so into the novel and history, and so Koei Tecmo programmed all this stuff into the game. Not a Chinese developer but a Japanese developer. It's also kind of cool how you can tell the developers are always thinking of ways to express the novel more. Of course, if you have war generals like Guan Yu, they should be good on the battlefield, but in the novel and in history, it's not just the fighting war generals who are great at leading troops. Very intelligent officers like Zhuge and Sima Yi are formidable leading troops too, or being the head generals of the army, so they would think of how to bring up the effectiveness of having smart people with you on the battlefield too, like if you appoint a very smart guy as a military advisor on the battlefield, maybe he can help better with finding enemy traps, which makes a huge difference, but I'm still figuring out how that works in Romance of Three Kingdoms 8. For example, I had one battle and it was funny because they added an ambush skill, and I think it works better for the defending side, so I'm not sure exactly where they are at times initially, so as I kept marching it was very clear, and then as I got closer to the city, just one unit showed up and it was this smart advisor guy, but his war stat is low, so of course I think I can take him very easily with my generals, but as I got close to his unit, the smart advisor guy has other skills like confuse and harness, and he ended up using the confused tactic successfully on my unit, and one of my units got confused and stuck, and I'm in a weaker state this way, and right after that a shitload of other units from war generals that were in ambush mode who I originally didn't see all started popping out, landing surprise special attacks on my unit and wiped my unit out. That's just like something they do in the novel. Reminds me of the Battle of Bo Wanpo in history when Zhuge used Liu Bei's unit as the bait, where he kept fighting and running away from Xia Hedun and led him deeper into the mountains, and the surprise ambush attacks of Zhang Fei and Zhao Yun came and flustered his unit, then Zhuge set up Guan Yu at the escape route to finish him off. There's also magic in the game too, but I have yet to see anyone with the ability to wield magic or control the weather yet. Should be super rare since in the novel only Zhuge was able to do that. I guess Zhang Jiao claimed he can use magic in the beginning too, that's how he started the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Another interesting example to show how detailed the developers were, historically Zhuge is only famous for being in the Jingzhou Xiangyang or Xianye Xiangyang, cause that's the infamous scene in the book where Liu Bei found and recruited him, cause Zhuge lives there, but Zhuge's ancestry actually dates back to Shandong province, and Zhuge has two brothers, an older brother Zhuge Jin who later joined Sun Quan and a younger brother Zhuge Jun. However, when Zuch was in his teens, his family moved with his uncle to Jiangxi province, and then ultimately later on they moved to Jingzhou Xianyang area. So the thing is, in some Romance of the Three Kingdom games, generals can't be discovered until they were maybe 15 or 16 years old at the youngest. So although Zhuge when his family was still in Shandong, he would have been maybe 13 or 14 years old max. That would be too young for him to show up in the game. However, if someone knew the history, they would know that his older brother Zuchjin, who might 16 years or older at the time when their family was still in Shandong before the move, and so in that game I went searching in the Shandong area to see if I can find his older brother to recruit when he was around 16 years old, and I was able to find him. But his older brother during the novel only showed up when he was older and following Sun Quan's side already. And that was in the south modern-day Jiangsu region, so most people didn't know Zuch and his family were from Shandong ages ago, but the developers knew that, and they knew that Zuch would be too young when he was in Shandong still, so we can't find Zuch in Shandong, but we can find his older brother there. But in certain versions characters can show up in different places as a first appearance depending on when you look for them. Like Zuch you might be able to find in Jiangxi when he's 15 or 16, but if you want to find him when he's like 18 years old or more, then it'll have to be either in Xianye or Xianyang. But yeah, shows you how much time and effort Japanese developers can put into games like Romance of the Three Kingdoms and how complete, and detailed and polished it is. If a Western company like EA or Activision makes a game, it's rushed, unfinished, unpolished, a hollow shell of a game shipped out for consumers so that they can milk people further with DLC and stuff later on. And likely came with launch issues like bugs and glitches too. Just look at any Bethesda game or Cyberpunk 2077 or the most recent Sims or SimCity or Star Wars Battlefront or the recent GTA remasters. All released with either bugs and glitches or unfinished or both in order to further milk the consumer with pre-planned DLC that they sell to the consumer in a pre-order version called the Season Pass. Japanese developers, because they have more integrity, rarely if ever milk the consumer like this, and if they do sell DLC it's often for small cosmetic items. They don't ship games half finished or half empty and then with DLC that's actually necessary or crucial to finishing the game. It's the same with Yonex. Family-owned and run Japanese company. They don't have the marketing that Western tennis racket brands like Wilson or Head do, and they don't have as many sponsorships, but their quality is way more consistent. And the reason why some tennis pros use Wilson or Head instead is because that's what they grew up and are used to. They might not be as used to all the benefits Yonex gives you. Like an example is the Yonex S-Zone design really gives you a lot of controlled power. Now it's a matter if the player likes having so much power. For me it was too much power cause I'll be hitting it out of bounds too much, so instead I went with the Yonex V-Core, which is a spin-heavy racket. From an objective standpoint, Yonex rackets by far have the best build quality, paint job, and quality control. If you look at the racket, the amount of paint work and labels and everything takes a lot more effort to do than other brands, so it looks and feels more like a custom artisan work since it's all done in Japan. The other brands, the rackets you can tell take less time to make cause less detailing. And in terms of QC it's not even close. Pretty much all racket shops and people say all the other major brands state plus or 7 grams of variance. Cause they're all made in China by the same factories. But all the shops and reviewers say when they measure all the Yonex rackets in their inventory that they all measure perfect, exactly the same as the stated weight. No variance. And on the rare chance there is one, it's just 1 gram difference. And this all makes sense cause companies like Wilson are just part of a large publicly traded corporation doing the usual endorsement deals, marketing and then making stuff in China. But Yonex is still privately owned by the original founding family. And Yonex spent $0 marketing and just a few endorsed athletes compared to Wilson and Head. But they spent all their money building a new massive research and production facility in their hometown and a new state-of-the-art sports stadium for their athletes with tennis courts that mirror the 4 Grand Slam courts so athletes can train there and test out their newly designed rackets. For Yonex, the original founder, up until the day he died, he adamantly stood by keeping their production and office all in their hometown in Japan, and he told his descendants to do the same. Cause the hometown of Yonex, like Seiko, is in a very cold area of Japan with snow, and he believes the cold climate in their hometown gives people their character, which translates into the craftsmanship of their products. And talking about integrity, it's just like the creator of Slam Dunk manga, which to this day is one of the best-selling manga of all time. In the 1990s the publishers wanted him to keep the series going for both the manga and anime cause it was such a phenomenon. I mean, it literally is the main reason why basketball became popular in Asia. Before Slam Dunk, not many people in Japan and China were interested in basketball. Slam Dunk along with Michael Jordan single-handedly popularized the sport in those countries. Way before Yao Ming joined the NBA, it was Slam Dunk that popularized it in China. But the creator refused to continue the manga cause he said his vision for the ending and whole story arc was already set. He wanted to finish the story and ending his way and not cheapen it, and this was when Slam Dunk popularity was at its peak. If it was a popular Western series they would have milked it to death, like The Simpsons, which they should have killed off a long time ago. I mean, he could have easily kept it going and raked in money, but he ended it exactly the way he wanted, which left a lot of fans wanting more, but that's also what gave Slam Dunk its legendary reputation, cause it didn't sell out. And he never continued the series even though it's so popular, not until 10 years later when his former high school was going to get torn down, he got sentimental and went back to his old high school to camp out for days, and draw 10 days of additional stories for Slam Dunk just on the school chalkboards as a tribute to the school and his memories. Now that's artistic integrity. He only does things when he has the passion and inspiration. That's also why he didn't complete the anime until now when he just released the Slam Dunk movie. He only did it because he had the inspiration now, which is why the movie is so good. The only good thing I can say about 90s is that it had good dramatic movies and sitcoms. Of course we all know Seinfeld and Friends. People debate about which one is better. Many people say Seinfeld is better written and more clever than Friends, but I disagree. I watched every episode of both series. I would say Seinfeld at its peak and at its best is very funny, but they also have a lot of episodes, especially the middle and later seasons, where the writing falls flat, but people don't usually remember these episodes because they only play the good episodes on repeat. Everyone only remembers the famous episodes like the Soup Nazi and the Contest, but Seinfeld had a lot of so-so episodes too that people don't really remember. Whereas with Friends I think the writing was solid all the way through. They might not have as many iconic episodes as Seinfeld, but overall they had solid writing throughout the entire series. The beginning of Friends was a bit slow, sure, but once it picked up, it never stopped being funny. Also, the type of comedy in Friends is more varied than Seinfeld. Seinfeld is mostly a situational comedy where the comedy is created as a result of different situations the characters are in. They need a catalyst for this situational comedy, and it usually starts from George or Kramer, since these two characters basically carry the show comedically. Jerry and Elaine are more passive characters, and honestly the acting of Jerry and Julia are a bit subpar, especially with Jerry since he's not really a trained actor. These two characters are reactionary and most of their comedy comes from reacting to George and Kramer. Jason Alexander as George especially, carries much of the show's comedy as most of the funniest Seinfeld moments involve him. Whereas with Friends, all the actors are great and play off of each other and their chemistry is much more heartfelt than with Seinfeld's cast. You feel like with Friends the actors genuinely were friends with each other and they are likable and relatable people, whereas with Seinfeld the main characters are, to be honest, unlikable and unrelatable. Friends also has situational comedy, but in addition they can create spontaneous comedy just with one another and bounce jokes off of each other. They don't necessarily need a catalyst or something to start the comedy like in Seinfeld. In Friends it just spontaneously happens, and part of this is because each actor in Friends are equally as talented. Whereas in Seinfeld, as mentioned, it is carried by the acting of George, with some of Kramer's slapstick antics as well. With side characters, I'll admit Seinfeld's side characters seem to be much more actively involved with the comedy, like Newman and George's dad, but with Friends they do have some funny side characters like Gunther too, but overall involved much less with creating the comedy, as the core comedy is created by the six friends themselves. And that goes to show again, how the main core actors of Friends carry the show. With Seinfeld, sometimes the side characters are so funny they overshadow the main characters. Sometimes they are funnier than Jerry and Elaine, and that's not supposed to happen in a comedy. Your main characters are supposed to drive the comedy. If there's funnier side characters, then that's not necessarily a good thing. It means your main characters are lacking the ability to drive the comedy forward, like in Friends where the main characters are core to the comedy creation. So overall I find Friends to be the more consistently funny show, but Seinfeld does have its moments, especially in certain iconic episodes. Which I'll admit that in terms of the iconic degree of each episode, Seinfeld seems to have that more so than Friends, but that's because Friends comedy is so consistent that any episode can be just as funny as another, whereas Seinfeld you keep going back to the same episodes because Seinfeld isn't as consistent and those episodes are actually the funniest ones people always remember. Also, those idiots on Head-Fi have no idea what they are talking about. I remember when the Otis LCD2 was released, everyone was raving about it online, and when I tried them, I said they were way too warm. But everyone online said no, they were reference quality and very balanced, even though they clearly were not. Then when Otis LCD3 came out, those added back some of the rolled off trebles and made it more balanced. Then everyone online was saying how the LCD3 was balanced and reference quality and the LCD2 were not, and that was what I kept telling them about the LCD2s, but those idiots wouldn't listen until Otis came out with a new headphone. See, people just want to jump on the bandwagon and agree with each other without knowing what they are talking about. And by the way, for pool cues, I prefer my pool cues unwrapped and with a smaller tip size for better spin control and less deflection. I used a snooker cue to play pool when I started out and got used to the smaller tip size, and I was making shots nobody else could make. Since snooker is much more difficult and requires more skill to play than pool, it makes sense that whatever snooker players use would be even better for pool. Pool is more casual and professionals got by with bigger 13mm tips and bad form for years, and only since the 1990s with Predator making smaller tip sizes for lower cue ball deflection, now pool players are finally starting to catch on to using smaller tip sizes. But I hate that pool cues are usually wrapped because unwrapped gives a better grip, and that's why snooker cues never have wraps on them. That's also why Efren Reyes, arguably the greatest pool player ever, also uses unwrapped cues. Oh yeah, you borrowed my Hori fighting stick, right? How was it? I think it's pretty good out of the box. I think the Hori fighting stick with Hayabusa parts is actually like an improved version of the Sanwa parts that we usually see in arcade sticks. You see, Sanwa out of the box isn't actually very well calibrated. But you see many fanboys online insist on using Sanwa parts because of Mad Catz. Mad Catz introduced the first popular fighting sticks in the late 2000s when Street Fighter 4 came out, and because they were the first decent arcade sticks most people used, and because they marketed the sticks as having Sanwa parts tying it to Japanese arcades, now everyone thinks Japanese arcades only use Sanwa parts. But the truth is, Japanese arcades used both Sanwa and Seimetsu parts. It's a misconception that the Japanese arcades only use Sanwa. And it's also a misconception that Seimetsu sticks are only good for shooters. But Seimetsu is a different type of stick that's tighter and has less throw. My stick is a Kenba Q4 modded with a Seimetsu LS32. Thing is, Kenba at best is giving you Sanwa parts. Thing with companies like Mayflash and Kenba though is that these companies are Chinese. And they don't bother getting the official licenses with console makers. Same with that Korean Itaki brand. So you can sometimes find sticks that are cross-compatible with a shitload of consoles and PC with these brands. But if you focus on just the parts, then why pay more for a Kenbo with Sanwa parts when Hori's Hayabusa parts might be better? Thing is, there's too many idiots online that don't know what they are talking about. Either they suck at fighting games and try to act like they know which stick is good or not, or they can't really tell the difference because they suck at the execution. That's the case I find with those 8-bit reviewers online. Plays a game for 5 minutes then proclaims it's the best controller ever. So you hear the dumb talk from people online saying dumb-ass things like Sanwa is good for fighting games and Shimetsu because of its quick response is good for shoot MUPS only. Which is complete bullshit. I hate using Sanwa for anything cause it's not responsive enough for me. I'm way better in fighting games with a Shimetsu even though it's still not 100% what I want. These people just keep saying the same crap they hear from others and they themselves might suck at the games and might be slow as fuck when they execute, so they have no idea. Like yesterday I was playing against that joystick shop owner in Street Fighter and he kept exclaiming my movement is too fast for the stick maybe, which is why even one frame of lag from a converter throws my game off. Cause when I execute I'm doing stuff really fast, to the point where I'm actually doing moves before they are even coming out yet and the game has to respond afterwards. I'm executing certain moves at the very edge of what the game is capable of, so the game actually has to catch up with my inputs. So that's why even a bit of input lag from a converter I can tell because my moves will just drop with even a hint of lag. That's what I'm talking about with those 8-bit reviewers online. They suck and can't play any intense games well, so they play Super Mario for 5 minutes and proclaim those controllers are the best ever. Well, how do they know how good that bad is if they don't test with games that require split-second execution like Street Fighter? And even when they do have issues with the controller they will gloss over them and still give them high marks because they like the retro look of the controller. Can't trust any of these casuals online. So you see there's a lot of idiots online that might suck at the game but pretend like they know their stuff. They do a few fireballs and play the game on easy and act like they know their sticks and pads. For me, when judging a stick or pad, I just need to play Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and maybe Street Fighter 5. That's all I need to judge the stick or pad. Cause Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the way I play it on the hardest difficulty and with that speed, the margin of error on the counters and execution I have to do is down to a split-second frame, otherwise the move drops. So I can test sticks and pads down to the split-second frames. That's necessary for winning in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on hardest. Also, the Hori Hayabusa buttons that you have are very unique. It's very different from both the usual arcade buttons and the Sanwa or Shimetsu buttons. The Hayabusa buttons seem very uniquely and thoughtfully designed. If you press them, it feels like there's some give, but then as you press deeper there's an interesting tension. They also seem to be designed to be very reactive, even if you press the outer edge of the button and not straight on, and it will still register. So it's very good for certain fighting game techniques where you have to quickly press a lot of buttons fast, like say Street Fighter 4 hit detection from a medium into a super and then cancel into an FADC to super. Cause you need super fast responsive buttons for combos like that. For a lot of trick techniques where you need to quickly flick 2 buttons at once, I think that's what Hori was trying to design. So they designed the buttons in a unique and thoughtful way. The lever also seems like it's better and more responsive than Sanwa. The much earlier Hori sticks used Sanwa parts, but they went away from that and started to design their own parts cause they want to better Sanwa and Shimetsu. So those idiots online who got brainwashed from Mad Catz marketing from back in the day are always falsely thinking that Sanwa is the gold standard, which isn't true. All SNK original cabinets use Shimetsu though. But since Mad Catz was the first to get a popular home arcade stick with their tournament edition stick and they chose to use Sanwa and then marketed the shit out of it, in their marketing campaigns they kept saying Sanwa and only Sanwa as the actual Japanese arcade sticks, but not Shimetsu of course since they weren't using them. But this led to brainwashing all these Western players into believing that Sanwa was the norm in Japanese arcades, which it wasn't. In truth, both Sanwa and Shimetsu were used. Sega cabinets for example used the Shimetsu LS32 and Neo Geo cabinets used the Shimetsu LS40 stick. Before Mad Catz, enthusiasts playing fighting games at home made custom sticks and there was no talk about Sanwa. All this talk about Sanwa is because of the Mad Catz marketing. That's why you only hear Western players writing about this shit. And also, just because it was used in the arcades doesn't necessarily mean it was the best quality. It could also be because the parts are cheap cause they need to mass produce the cabinets affordably. They're not making luxury products, so using arcade parts doesn't always mean better. Sanwa is mass produced for arcade cabinets doesn't mean it's good. It's like a clock you find in a Toyota car. Do you think that's the gold standard of clocks just because it's been used in all Toyota cars? I personally find Sanwa to be overrated. It's way too slow for me. Mad Catz is the perfect example of what I am talking about with Western brands versus Japanese brands. Mad Catz is all marketing and hype and no real substance to their products or quality. They got by with their tournament sticks because they used Sanwa parts. But all other Mad Catz controllers and fight pads where they used their own stuff sucks like shit. They were making these Street Fighter fight pads and marketing them as some pro shit, but that pad sucks so badly. They got the Street Fighter license, slapped a bunch of Street Fighter characters on the fight pads, marketed them like crazy, saying how great they are, and shipped them out to influencers and sponsors, players and tournaments. Kind of like how 8-bit pays for those YouTube glowing reviews online from sellouts like Spawnwave who barely review the device and immediately praise it as the best thing ever. That's how they fool the public. Mad Catz Street Fighter 4 fight pad sucks so much. They gave no effort to making an actual good product. Just kept marketing the shit out of the stuff, slap on Street Fighter characters, sent them to influencers and probably paid them. There was this one shit-ass jerk black guy Street Fighter player who was pretty hated and not that good, and he's a total jerk and sellout. Mad Cat sent him one of their fight pads and probably paid him off. The retard does a review, he just opens the box, holds the control pad a bit, looks at it and says, guys, this thing is so amazing, it must be a 10/10, but he didn't even plug it in to play with it. Another issue is the square gate on some Sanwa sticks. The plastic square gate restrictor when new has very pronounced corners, which makes it harder to do circular motions. Seimetsu though has octagonal gates, and I played well on those. Although sometimes you might not be able to crouch when you want to, cause you might have missed a corner. Like you thought you were crouching for your second hit but actually not enough, so you end up just standing and doing the second hit. That would happen sometimes when it's not the square gate. However, doing circular motions should be smoother. Whereas a square gate when new makes it hard to do circular motions cause it impedes your movement a bit. So it seems like a well-worn-in stick with a square gate where the corners aren't as pronounced seems to be a nice medium. Now a Kanba with a worn-in Sanwa and square gate is not bad at all. Comparing it to my new Seimetsu, there's actually a couple of very fundamental maneuvers that I've been testing out with both sticks. It's the crouch medium poke to bait the CPU to jump. Then I react very fast to do a dragon punch to counter the jump. So going from a down back block crouch to a crouch medium poke kick to a forward dragon punch. I'm actually better on the Sanwa stick right now with this maneuver. Because the square gates are more worn in, so they're not as sharp and pronounced, so my stick gets trapped in the corner less. In terms of everything else, the Seimetsu and Sanwa are close. Seimetsu I can tell is still tighter and faster by a bit, like just enough to where it's probably a better option for shoot MUPS cause it has less dead space. But for fighting games like Street Fighter 4 I was testing more complex combos where I need to link supers out of specials. I can do them consistently on both. But here's the thing, this is a pretty new non-broken in Seimetsu vs a well broken in Sanwa. I can imagine in the future when the Seimetsu square gate gets worn in more, then it'll be even better. Because out of the box, I hated the Sanwa. But worn in, the Sanwa got better and closer to a new Seimetsu now. But Seimetsu might be even better later on. Now with your Hayabusa it seems that out of the box it feels like a Sanwa, but just like the Seimetsu it performs well out of the box already. Whereas a Sanwa sucks out of the box. So out of the box, I like the Hayabusa and Seimetsu a lot better than a Sanwa. But after a Sanwa is broken in it's quite good. But after breaking in the Hayabusa more I'm sure it will get better too. It feels a hair more tighter and more responsive than the Sanwa out of the box though, which I think was Hori's goal. So it's got the good parts of a broken in Sanwa but with more responsiveness and just a bit tighter with less dead space. Also the Hayabusa square gate doesn't feel as pronounced as the Sanwa. So you can tell Hori did that on purpose and put a lot of effort into fine-tuning the Hayabusa stick and buttons, and you can really see what their mindset is. The Hayabusa uses a V-shaped part whereas the Sanwa uses a bowl shape. So as a result the Hayabusa can trigger the switches faster and it might cause less wear and tear in the long term too. That's why Hayabusa feels like a Sanwa but with more responsiveness. Hori is your typical Japanese company with Japanese mentality. They just quietly make good products, very low-key, doesn't market much or sponsor anyone, but just focuses on making quality components. They spent a lot of time and R&D to design their own stick and buttons cause they want to beat Sanwa and Seimetsu. That's very Japanese. They always take an idea, whether it be with automobiles, audio equipment, blue jeans, TVs, and reinvent it and make it so much better. That's why Japanese devastated the American industries in the 1960s and 1970s. Honda, Toyota, and Nissan were making cars that were much cheaper and more reliable than American cars. Sony were making those Trinitron TVs that were killing RCA TVs back then. Sony, Nakamichi, Denon, Rotel, Marantz, Onkyo, Technics, Pioneer, Yamaha, these audio companies came out and pretty much changed the hi-fi audio market, made very good quality equipment at reasonable prices, compared to all the overpriced Western audio brands like Macintosh as usual. With denim jeans, they took what Levi's pioneered and took it further, and now Japanese selvage denim is very highly respected around the world. They still use old shuttle looms and real indigo dye to make the jeans, and unlike Western brands which are all just marketing and hype, Japanese products are actually worth the money. They might be expensive, but that's because it literally took that much labor and craftsmanship to make them. It's not just because of some celebrity endorsement and some marketing buzzwords like for Western products. For headphones it's the same story, right? Audio-Technica, Final Audio, Denon, Sony, Fostex, Yamaha, when have you heard any reliability issues with them? When have they ever been overpriced and overmarketed like the Western stuff like Bose or Beats or Apple? Now the issue with some headphone reviewers online though, is that they try to match the sound signature of every headphone to the Harman curve, and if it doesn't match the curve, they try to EQ it to the curve, and if that doesn't work they proclaim it sucks. Websites like Audio Science Review and Sound Guys do this. It drives me nuts. These idiots don't understand that the Harman curve is not a reference curve. It's the curve that Harman conducted studies into and discovered that the vast majority of the population would prefer. That does not mean it's a reference or neutral signature. Yet you have these idiots online saying a headphone sucks just because it doesn't match the signature, which is bullshit. So that's what pulls down brands like Focal and Sennheiser, where their headphones tend to have more of a neutral signature. But the problem is everyone prefers V-curves or Harman curves now, so of course nobody except true audiophiles appreciate Focal and Sens very much. The Samsung Galaxy Buds for example are tuned to Harman, which by the way isn't surprising considering that Samsung owns Harman, but that doesn't make them automatically better than a Focal or Sennheiser, and furthermore these guys do these measurements on distortion yet never talk about soundstage, detail, imaging, which cannot be measured and can only be determined by listening. That's the issue with these headphone reviewers online. But yeah, you won't see Japanese audio companies pull bullshit like what Bose does, not publishing their specifications online, or using celebrity endorsements like Apple and Beats, or hyping up the design of their product like those Korean Estelle and Kern guys, who by the way, made some of the most uncomfortable feeling digital audio players I've ever held, and crazy overpriced of course. This Japanese mentality even applies to products like pool cues. You ever look online shopping for various pool cue brands, and most of them are American, right? Predator is the biggest one, but there's also Peck Hour, Musi, Jacoby, Joss, Obi, Sean, McDermott, Qtech, a lot of American brands, and you might hear some people like them, some people don't. But there's one brand that consistently comes up and universally considered high quality, and that is Mess. I've literally never heard anything bad about Mess. The quality of their cues is second to none, look beautiful, and perform great, and has a real nice solid hit compared to some of those other brands I mentioned. And guess which country produces Mess? That's right, Japan. Literally out of all the popular cue brands online, which are mostly American, and the one everyone considers the highest quality consistently is Japanese. Not a coincidence, right? Just shows you how reliable and consistent Japanese stuff can be. No bullshit, no hype, just giving the customer quality stuff. Or even for stuff like toys. Hasbro has really dumbed down the quality of their toys starting from the 1990s. G.I. Joe actually started the trend for action figures, and the original G.I. Joe was just army men dolls, but they were large figures with real cloth clothing, quite high quality actually. But then because of the Vietnam War, that original army men G.I. Joe line died out in the 70s. Then in the 80s they brought G.I. Joe back, but with a comic book and cartoon series with actual characters in a real story. But they stopped making it like the original big army men dolls and instead went the Star Wars route and made 3.75-inch plastic figures so they can accommodate making a shitload of vehicles for them, just like Star Wars. They made so much money from the vehicles. A smaller 3.75-inch figure line is easier to make vehicles for. So they were also able to make that huge 7 or 8 feet long G.I. Joe aircraft carrier. Back then toy companies were so ambitious. With He-Man, they made so many crazy playsets, and even made an Eternia playset, which was a huge thing that was essentially like 3 playsets in one, which was really expensive at the time. But yeah, the 80s had so many large franchises for kids. Star Wars, He-Man, G.I. Joe, Transformers, Ninja Turtles, Ghostbusters, Hot Wheels. By the 90s, the quality of the toys diminished. You can tell they lost a lot of the older kids to video games, so they focused more on the young kids. So you have stuff like Pokemon, Beanie Babies, which are really childish stuff compared to what we had in the 80s. The toy companies had to aim for even younger kids that haven't started playing video games yet in the 90s. In the 80s, toy companies had a much larger share of the market, so you had much more interesting cartoons in the 80s on TV with darker stuff. Just G.I. Joe cartoon alone, episode 1. Snake Eyes, who's a silent ninja commando character that's always dressed in black with a helmet that doesn't talk. He sacrificed himself to bring down a door to save his friends and colleagues on a special ops mission cause the room was rigged with radioactive smoke coming out. After he broke down the door to stop the smoke from spreading, Scarlet on the other side of the glass wall and him was looking at each other between the glass wall and he put their palms against the glass, and Scarlet was shedding a tear. While Snake Eyes couldn't talk, but he held his palms on the glass looking at her. The backstory of this is Snake Eyes and Scarlet back in the day had some feelings for each other. But on a mission before the chopper was falling, and Scarlet's uniform was caught in the chopper so she couldn't jump out. Snake Eyes wouldn't leave the chopper and tried to help Scarlet break free. The chopper burned and crashed, and Snake Eyes, while his face and throat was burning, carried Scarlet out and away from the wreckage while his face and throat burned away. That's why he couldn't talk, cause his vocal cords were all destroyed and his face was fucked up, so he always wears a mask. That's very gritty stuff for kids back then. Optimus Prime dying in the 1987 Transformers movie is another example. He's the main character and father figure, and they just killed him off just like that along with the other Autobots. Even some episodes of Smurfs back then had more darkness and horror. Nowadays cartoons and toys both got dumbed down for kids. Again, the 90s was when companies decided to make the cartoons purely comical and childish compared to the more mature themes of the 80s cartoons. And toy companies dumbed down the quality of the toys starting from the 90s as well. All the original Transformers characters were 100% based on already produced Japanese robot toys. And the designs weren't altered at all. They just slapped a name on the toys. Originally in the 70s, Japanese were making robots that combined and also transformed into futuristic spaceships. But by early 80s they were making transforming toys that turned into realistic modern vehicles and household electronic items. So the Japanese toy that inspired Optimus Prime really did transform into a red semi-truck trailer. Same with Bumblebee and everyone else. Just with the toy line in Japan it was called Microchange and Diaclone. The original toy for Megatron in Japan pre-Transformers cartoon was called Gun Robo. Those two toy lines, Microchange and Diaclone, were both by Takara but weren't related. They were supposed to be in different universes. One line was for vehicles that change and the other was for stationary items that change like cameras, cassettes, guns, and stuff, but Hasbro wanted to sell them in the US, so Hasbro bought the licensing rights to everything and tried to figure out a way to put them into one show or line. And they also added stuff from Macross and other Japanese franchises. So yeah, much like with Power Rangers, which was based on the Japanese Super Sentai franchise, Transformers is essentially a Western creation based off of original Japanese properties. The Japanese toy industry was way more robust and developed and ahead of its time compared to America since the 1950s. You can already tell with Godzilla and Kaiju and Ultraman that Japan already had a good foundation for toys and franchises starting from that time. And a lot of these 1950s and 1960s robot toys affected Hollywood science fiction robot designs. The 80s was the peak of the toy business, cause the 90s came and video games really ate into the toy business. And by the late 90s a new line of adult toys were made for adult collectors instead like McFarlane. And the prices for these toys keeps going up over time. This goes back to what I'm saying about the difference between Western companies and Japanese companies. Western companies that they are greedy bastards who only care about their bottom lines and profit margins and will take any opportunity to hike up their prices, like because of COVID-19 for example, and use it as an excuse to keep prices high. A lot of Western companies are publicly traded stock companies who are more worried about pleasing their investors and shareholders than about customers. Western companies are greedy and just worry about balance sheets. Just look at the bullshit Hasbro has been doing. They use all these excuses to jack up prices. Oil prices, costs, shipping costs, and say prices need to go up, and they keep jacking up prices to test the waters by releasing one-off exclusive figures that are nothing special but create artificial demand by making them limited and then jacking up prices 40% just to test to see if people will pay for it. Then Russia invades Ukraine and they use that as an excuse to jack up prices to compensate for lost revenue. Everyone's losing money not selling to Russia, but it doesn't mean you jack up prices to your customers to make up for it. Then the CEO says we are looking to up our profit growth by 50% in the next few years. So how can you tell shareholders you will increase profits 50% and then turn around and tell customers you need to jack up prices? Just compare this to Japanese CEOs who even in times of economic downturn will cut their own salaries to keep the costs to the end customer the same. It actually happened to Nintendo during the 3DS and Wii U era, which were dark times for Nintendo. Nintendo President Satoru Iwata took pay cuts to keep the company afloat and in the green. Very rarely will Japanese companies ever jack up prices even when there's an economic downturn due to COVID-19 or a war or whatever, but as usual Western companies will seize the opportunity to jack up prices to end consumers. So they are under pressure to constantly increase revenue, either by price hikes or cost cutting or both. For Japanese companies, most companies are privately held, not publicly traded, so they don't have this mentality of coming up with ideas of how to gouge and cost cut. They are more focused on products and customers. Japanese stuff I noticed in the mall are way better quality for the price. I saw a sweater on sale in Japan for $50, uses polyester not wool, but it's the nicest polyester I ever felt. Super soft. For a Western company they need to show growth on the balance sheet for investors. They may eventually cost cut or opt to use cheaper polyester while hiking up prices, then use mega sales if no suckers buy their high-priced items. So we are seeing a trend of Western products which are shittier with stupid inflated high prices. So the products from Western brands here feel like mass-marketed junk. Soulless products. With Japanese stuff cause they focus on the products, you get exactly what they advertise. Even Uniqlo or Muji you go in and the products are affordable, well thought out and designed with minimal marketing. Their soft heat tech t-shirts actually feel quite close to a European luxury t-shirt that cost like $150. The Uniqlo t-shirts cost less than Gap and they feel closer to an Armani t-shirt. They really have things well thought out when designing, that's what they focus on. That's the mentality for most Japanese companies and why Japanese people are so OCD and picky about everything. They're used to everything being well designed. That's why on Japanese clothing sites in the descriptions they will go super in detail about the types of material they chose for every element and the reasons why. With Western brands they try to create marketing buzzwords or try to make something feel special when it really isn't. Like with Swiss or German watches. Swiss-made might have a law that says 60% of the value must come from Switzerland, but it doesn't matter because Swiss salaries are super high, so 80% of the watch components might have come from China, but in the end as long as they are assembled and inspected in Switzerland, then there's your 60% value and you can slap a Swiss-made sticker on it. And on top of that you have all this marketing and celebrity endorsements. Brands like Rolex, Omega, and Tag, who are being some of the main culprits, just have some celebrity wear it and the value of the watches will go up and suckers will pay more for it, regardless of the inherent value of the watch itself. With German watches I find it might be even worse because although many people say German watches are better value than Swiss watches, they often go with very minimalistic or simplistic designs, calling it Bauhaus or whatever and then still selling it at a premium. A lot of those German Pilot watches are very simplistic with printed dials, probably cost them very little to product and they still mark it up big time. Compare this to Japanese watches. Seiko, Citizen, Orient, all in-house movements, and no extra upcharges. Although recently Seiko have been trying to push prices higher to compete with some of the luxury Swiss stuff, but overall still a good value compared to the Western luxury stuff. Especially Grand Seiko, the polishing on Grand Seiko cases and dial finishing on their watches is better than any Western brand bar none. Not even Patek Philippe can compare. With Grand Seiko, even each individual wheel disc is hand polished. In terms of case, dial, finishing, there's no Western luxury watches that can compare with Grand Seiko, as each individual piece in a Grand Seiko is hand polished with a method called Zaratsu polishing. It's the level of finishing and attention to detail you cannot find in any other watch. Even the power reserve hand and other hands you don't see any screw or connectors there and it's all just one piece. They don't even want you to see the pivot connection even though it's unnoticeable in person. The attention to detail of Grand Seiko is far beyond any of those expensive top-tier Western brands. And since Grand Seiko also has the spring drive movement, they are also far more accurate than any Western luxury watches as well. The only area where a Western luxury watch can compete is movement decoration, and that's only in the super high end. Even some of the cheaper $30,000 to $50,000 Pateks or an Alang Saxonia don't really have better decorations than Grand Seikos. You have to go up to the $100,000 mark to actually get better finishing than a $5,000 Grand Seiko. But you see even a lot of Alang watches like Saxonia, the markers and indices are just printed and takes way less work to do than a Grand Seiko with how nice each applied index is hand-zaratsu polished. That's why I always find watches like Panerai a rip-off because most of their watches are dial markers which are just printed on and their finishing isn't that great. They just sell a lifestyle. Typical Italians are style over substance. Italians are lazy sometimes and will cut corners while trying to sell you this lifestyle. That's why you see Panerai is one of the most faked watches ever cause they are so easy to make. IWCs as well, so easy to fake because those dials are easy to make. With Grand Seikos, good luck faking them, that goes to show which watches take more effort to make. Cause the Japanese are so OCD, you need to have trained for 3 years to be able to be a polisher. And sometimes certain Patek or Alang their movements might look more decorated but that doesn't mean they are better finished. Grand Seiko's movements even when less decorated, are finished better. Their attention to detail to finish and polish every little piece perfectly even for the movement is really nice. And plus Seiko unlike most Swiss brands, literally makes everything in-house. Only Rolex and a few other Swiss brands can say that. But Seiko even make their own crystals, their own screws, their own balance springs, everything. But with a lot of Swiss brands, a lot of the parts actually come from China, they just assemble it and QC it in Switzerland, but they didn't design every little component like Seiko did. Now I do have respect for Rolex, Patek, Vacheron, Alang because at least they make their own parts. But for brands like Panerai, Tag, Baume, these guys aren't real watchmakers because they don't really make their own movements. They are more designers since they make watch designs but they don't make the movements or any parts themselves. Now about in-house movements, I think being able to make your own movement is good for giving that brand respect as a watchmaker, but at certain times I don't mind if the watch has a standard EDA or Celida or Valjoux movement either. It makes it more affordable and also much more easier to service in the future. With in-house movements of course only the original company can repair it and chances are it will cost quite a bit. And what happens if the company is defunct? And there's nobody else that can service a very unique movement. So I think people focus too much on the in-house movement stuff. But yeah, overall it goes back to what I'm saying about Japanese stuff versus Western stuff. Seiko is typical of the Japanese mindset. Makes everything in-house, all the parts, makes incredibly detailed high-end watches like Grand Seiko and Creditor, or even some regular Seiko just with unique hand-painted urushi lacquer or Shippo enamel dials or something. They don't make a big fuss about their watches, and if they are expensive it is for a good reason. Whereas with Western brands the price is usually 80% marketing and hype compared to the actual cost of making the watch itself. Another example, you buy a brand like Canada Goose or Arc'teryx and 80% of that cost is effectively marketing and branding, suckering people in. You can get the same fill power or better from a $150 Uniqlo padding jacket than a $1,000 Canada Goose. Or a Mont Blanc pen, typical Western luxury brand bullshit. The refills are fucking horrible. They purposely engineered them to dry out even if you don't use them. They dry out after just a couple months even when you don't use it so they can force you to buy more refills which cost 3 times the price of other refills. Just for reference my really nice Paker pen and my French pen the ink dries up in 5 to 7 years. But for Mont Blanc it takes only 2 months to dry up and their shape for the ink cartridge is proprietary. And Sennheiser only their most expensive HD 800 the ear pads fail after 5 years or so where it deteriorates and leaks color and loses padding so they can force you to buy new ear pads, which are $200 or $300 a pair. But they only make the ear pads for their most expensive models deteriorate, not their cheaper models. Cause they know how customers of the expensive HD 800 can be milked for more money. Never heard of ear pads for an expensive headphone failing. Typical German bullshit, engineered for failure just like their cars. My radiator for my BMW is leaking again and I fixed it 2 times already. My BMW would break down or have expensive problems every year or 2 which is utter bullshit. I have a few friends who open car repair shops and they all told me German cars are the worst and it's a fact, they market and hype up their stuff as luxury. They all tell me Japanese cars are by far the best and it's not even close, especially Toyota or Lexus. Recently when I got my BMW fixed for the millionth time, I had a long talk with them and they were servicing a Japanese car. When I went to pick up my car, the coolant expansion tank and reservoir tank was broken and leaking again so I had to get a new one again, which I already fixed 4 to 5 years ago. This never happens with Japanese cars. I've never heard of any Japanese cars leaking coolant. I never had any issues with my previous Japanese car but after buying the BMW now I've become a car engine expert because everything breaks down. The repair shop guy showed me the one in the Japanese car and he says with German cars the coolant tank is 2 pieces and they just glue it together so of course with the engine and even normal temperature outside it will eventually fail and split since it's just fluid. He says with Japanese cars the coolant tank is either 1 piece or if it's 2 pieces, then the 2 pieces are welded together. That's why you never hear of coolant leaking in any Japanese cars and that's just one example out of thousands of components in there. He said all other components you see this night and day difference in quality and with German cars it's like shit's all over the place in terms of layout and design and sometimes parts just go in places that doesn't make sense. They don't think about how these parts will interact, so it leads to lots of issues and problems. But with Japanese cars, he says you can tell everything under the hood has been pre-planned between all the different aspects and how all the parts interact so that you get much less failure. With German cars, he said you can tell they don't plan anything or organize and just cram everything in there, but it's also very telling just with the quality of how they design the parts. Just like with the glued coolant tank, all these parts are designed like shit and they will break down for sure in a few years. There's no way around it. It has to break down the way they designed it, and every few years when I have to get a new one in, the new part is exactly the same defective shit as the last one, so they won't improve on it, so it will just fail again eventually. But with Japanese cars, first off, you rarely see any defect or breakage, and if it does on a rare occasion and if it was a design issue, every time the new part that they order in has been redesigned and improved so that the same failure for that part won't happen again. So if this one piece failed after a few years, you get it fixed. The new part is actually different and improved to avoid the issue, and this is a part for an older model car. So they're even improving and redesigning parts for an old model car they aren't selling anymore, so that's Japanese integrity. For Western companies, they will think of any opportunity to nickel and dime customers for more money. That's the way they think. And in Japan it's the opposite. If something is expensive, it's because it genuinely costs that much to produce or make. This applies to even fruits and snacks in Japan. On average, the fruit in Japan is super good, but expensive. It's expensive because they really pay attention to the species and they try to keep farming the ones that turn out to be good. There's a Japanese documentary that shows these Japanese fruit growers on an apple farm, and they would literally rotate every apple on every tree just to make sure each side gets the same amount of sun so that it's red all around. Or Waigyo, of course you probably have heard that they do things like massage the cows and make them drink beer just to make them more relaxed, just to produce a higher quality beef. And with Japanese gummies, the flavor is so much more authentic than any Western gummy. And the packaging has a Ziploc design, so you open it, have a gummy, and then zip it to keep it fresh, cause most people won't eat it all at once. Literally any Western brand gummies like Haribo won't have this feature. In Japan every bag of gummies from all companies will have it, even the cheap $1 bags. And they taste way better than Haribo. Haribo is not super special, but Japanese gummies are like heaven. They taste like real fruit and some of them are loaded with vitamins and collagen, so it's healthy too. There's this sour brand called Tough Gummy which you must try if you go to Japan. It's a drink flavor gummy with sour coating on the outside, but all Japanese gummies are good. They have sour grape, sour cola, sour peach, and just 90 cents for a bag, and it's not too sour, just enough to give it a slight tangy feeling. You have to try the green musket grape flavor and Mikan orange flavors. Those are my favorite. They all have a bit of juice inside and it almost tastes like real fruit. And the potato chips in Japan are much better too. Especially the Kalbi Hokkaido potato chips. The flavor is amazing because Hokkaido potato naturally has a nice flavor to it, and they don't overload it too much with flavor like some Western potato chip brands. With Western potato chip brands like Lay's or Kettle Chips or Miss Vickie's or sometimes Old Dutch and Cape Cod, they load it with way too much flavor and that overpowers the natural flavor of the potato. Not to mention they don't really use any special kind of potato either. Sure, you do get the kettle cooked brands that you don't find in Japan, but the thing is Hokkaido potato has so much natural flavor and is fried so well that it doesn't need to be kettle cooked to have good flavor or to have good crunch. With Western brands it's always too much in extreme. Whenever they have something spicy, it's either not spicy at all or way too spicy that it burns your mouth. Whenever they have sour stuff, it's either not sour at all or way too sour. They purposely load up on the flavor in order to mask the fact that they use low quality potatoes and the natural flavor of their potatoes aren't very good. With those Kalbi Hokkaido chips though, a touch of salt or even their butter flavor is all you need and you get the natural flavor of the potato without anything masking the taste. If I ever do eat Western supermarket brands, I'll usually go for the lightly salted so that I can distinguish the quality of the potato. Covered Bridge used to make good chips, but I found that they must have switched potato supplies recently because their chips taste noticeably more inferior now compared to before. And this applies of course to every Japanese product. The craftsmanship and time they take on everything is insane. You see people literally spend their whole lives just to cultivate bonsai trees just to make sure they look absolutely perfect. Japanese swords and knives. World famous and renowned for a reason. There's a story about an old Japanese man who spends his entire life out in the countryside every day making rice from his own fields and making his own curry and putting them in the same vending machine and refilling it every single day. That's his passion and that's what he liked to do every single day of his life. You won't find this kind of dedication and passion commonly in other countries. Or with the traditional Japanese paintings done in the ukiyo-e style. Those were woodblock prints made hundreds of years ago. Ukiyo-e masters like Hiroshige is more famous for landscapes. Kuniyoshi and Yoshitoshi for portraits of actors and people, and some horror stuff like ghosts and yokai as well. And of course Hokusai does both landscapes and portraits. A lot of modern female ghost images in Asian movies actually came from old Japanese paintings. One of my favorite ghost stories is a made-for-kabuki play ghost story from 200 years ago in the Edo period, and there's a lot of ukiyo-e paintings about that ghost story. There's also shin-hanga, which is a more newer modern style of ukiyo-e from the early 1900s, and those are gorgeous too and have a Western influence, so there's modern details in it. By that time, although ukiyo-e wasn't as popular, but they're every bit as good. During the Edo period was when ukiyo-e was most popular, so artists of that period are more renowned. But starting from the late 1800s, foreigners became interested in ukiyo-e, so shin-hanga did more paintings for them. In fact, Hiroshige and Hokusai had a lot of influence on Western artists of that period like Claude Monet. That's why many of Monet's paintings were actually of Japanese gardens. but yeah, it just shows how developed Japanese culture was already by the late 1800s, compared to how recently Korea and China developed, which is why Japanese culture is so fascinating and unique to Westerners, since even by the 1950s they had a developed film and music industry by that time. Fascinating.